hypothetical. We weren't talking about Donald Trump very much. So things can always change.
We'd like to thank Breanne Pfannenstiel, the chief political reporter at the Des Moines Register, for being with us here today and taking us through the Democratic field in Iowa. Breanne, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It's time for our yearly Cram for the Exam segment. Andy Cunneen and Dan Larson will join us, and we'll take questions from students only as we help them prep for the upcoming AP government exam. We'll be right back.
On American History TV, today at 2 p.m. Eastern on Oral Histories. Our interview of World War II Navajo code talker Samuel Sow.
Big mouse, turkey, period, space, sheep. Sheep's eye is cured. That's all it said in plain English. But what it really meant is Mount Suribachi is secured.
Then at 8 p.m. on Lectures in History, Baylor University professor Julianne Sweet on the American military during the Revolutionary War.
So this right here is a handcrafted work of art created by a gunsmith who made lock, stock, and barrel every piece of this by hand. Each one's going to be individually different. This is why I'm saying don't lose it.
Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, astronaut Michael Collins on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing.
I think people in general, they want to go, to see, to touch, to smell, to understand, wherever that may be, on the surface of the planet, a little bit above it, way above it, to the moon, beyond the moon to Mars, whatever. I think it's somehow within us to have this, it's not a need, but this will, this desire to explore.
And at 8 on the presidency, author Richard Carwardine on the sense of humor of Abraham Lincoln.
Riding through the woods, he met a lady on horseback. He waited for her to pass, but instead she stopped and scrutinized him before saying, "Well, for land's sake, you are the homeliest man I ever saw." "Oh, yes, madam, but I can't help it," he replied. "No, I suppose not," said the lady, "but you might stay at home."
This weekend on American History TV, on C-SPAN 3. Washington Journal continues.
We're back with our annual Cram for the Exam segment as we talk about the upcoming Advanced Placement U.S. government exam and what students can expect on the test. We're joined by Andrew Cunneen and Daniel Larson, both of the Aldi E. Stevenson High School, and they're here every year to help get our students ready for this test. I have to say, I love this segment, so I can't wait to hear the questions from the students. But I want to remind everyone really quickly that we're going to take calls from students only for this segment because we want our students ready to take this AP test. Gentlemen, good morning.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Good morning.
So, what's the best use for the time, for your time, if you're a student getting ready to take this test? What should you be doing?
Well, it's Saturday morning live, so we know a lot of teachers out there, Mr. Putnam, Mr. Smith, Ms. Bouchard, are with their students now prepping for the exam. They have pancake breakfasts. And we know some students will be prepping during their favorite TV show Sunday night. The test is Monday, but no time like now to cram for the exam.
Jesse, my heart goes boom, boom, boom thinking about this exam because the exam's different this year. Yes, the exam has been redesigned. We are now working off a new framework, and our questions and our studying should be geared towards the framework and how this new exam is organized. There are now 55 multiple choice questions, and you have 80 minutes to do that. And the questions will look different this year than they have in the past. We also know we have 4 free response questions, 4 FRQs, but we know exactly what they are. You'll have 100 minutes to write 1 concept application question. You'll also have to answer a quantitative analysis question. There'll be a SCOTUS, Supreme Court case comparison, and then the one we're all waiting for, an argumentative essay at the end. So excited. We won't have much time to snap our infinity gauntlet after Monday, so today's the day. Let's go back and review.
Okay, so night before the test, what do? Do you big dinner, big breakfast, small breakfast? How do you get ready as you go into this test?
A lot of carbs, but a lot of vocab too. Load your plate with vocabulary. The redesign has provided us essential knowledge points. I know what we do in our class. We put those words on cards, and we ask ourselves, hey, do I know Citizens United? We know it's going to be on the test. It's one of the 15 mentioned Supreme Court cases. I'm reviewing the court cases, those 15 essentials, the 9 documents, and the words.
And then go back to those tips your kindergarten teacher taught you. Follow the directions, particularly on the FRQ writing section. There are certain directives you're going to be told to do. Make sure you follow those directions, very detailed, to maximize your points on the essay writing.
So once again, this is one of my favorite segments because we get to hear from high school students, and I get to hear the shout outs to the teachers. Right. Being the son of 2 public school teachers, both retired, I love the shout outs. And we're going to I'm going to do my own shout out this morning. We're going to shout out to Dan Corrigan of St. Ignatius 8th period AP government class in Cleveland. And I want to hear all these shout outs. But let me make sure I give the other students our telephone numbers. If you are in the high school student in the Eastern or Central time zone, we want you to call 202-748-8000. If you're a high school student in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-748-8001. And you can always tweet us your questions to C-SPAN at C-SPAN WJ using the hashtag C-SPAN Cram #4 exam. And we already have students calling in now. So let's go to Emma, who's calling from Dublin, Ohio. Emma, do you have a question, or would you want us to give you a question?
Do you want to take a question?
We'll just ask a question.
This is Emma and Julius from Mr. Patton's first period class.
We were wondering how the federal bureaucracies overstep their bounds into the executive and legislative branches.
Great question. One of the words you should know is bureaucratic discretion and bureaucratic rulemaking. And this is the idea that when Congress writes the law, a lot of times they don't go into the nitty-gritty specifics of how that law is going to be implemented, and they allow the different executive agencies and departments discretion or power to determine some of the specific ways that law can be implemented.
This drives to one of the big ideas. There are 5 big ideas on this year's exam: constitutionalism, liberty and order, but this speaks to the competing interests in public policy making. The federal bureaucracy is another player. But what makes it interesting, it's a great question, I think we'll have a chance maybe to write about it, we'll certainly see multiple choice on it, is that discretionary power, that the federal bureaucracy can write regulations, enforce regulations, and actually adjudicate those regulations. Does that violate the separation of powers? Great question.
Let's take a question from Kaylee, who's calling from Forest City, Pennsylvania. Kaylee, are you looking for a question, or do you have a question?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
How can it be said that the signing of the Constitution was unanimous when the deputies of only 12 states signed and some delegates refused to sign?
Woo! I feel like I'm on Jeopardy, and I don't, this is like Final Jeopardy, but this won't be a Jeopardy test. This will not be like AP US History, where you drive deep into historical phenomenon, like how many voted for the Constitution, things like this. Is the Constitution extremely important? Of course it is. We carry one with us wherever we go. But this test will speak to the big picture items, like the compromises at the convention. Why was the convention held in the first place? Because the Articles of Confederation failed. Know some of those key amendments: 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 13, 14, 15, 19, 24, 26. Down to the debate and who voted, I don't think we'll need to know that.
But you should know, like Mr. Larson said, the Great Compromise, which created bicameralism with the House and the Senate. You should know the Three-Fifths Compromises and the other compromises pertaining to slavery. And you should know excuse me, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the idea that the Federalist Papers were written to promote a stronger central government, and the Anti-Federalists, like Brutus I, were written with the idea that a strong central government could infringe on liberty.
Kaylee, do you want to try one of our study questions?
Sure.
Okay. Which of the following would a state consider to increase the voter turnout of younger voters from the data in the table? Can you see the data in the table on the screen there, Kaylee?
No, I can.
Okay, well, I'll read it to you. So turnout for ages 18 to 29 in recent elections. In 2000, it was 41, 2004, 48, 2008, 52, 2012, 49, 2016, 50. And I'll read the question to you again and give you the options. Which of the following would a state consider to increase the voter turnout of younger voters from the data? A, implement stricter voter ID standards. B, increase residency requirements to 60 days. C, add more voting by mail and early voting options. Or D, reduce the hours of voting on election day.
I'm going to go with C.
Great job, Kaylee.
See, it is, and it speaks to one of our big ideas, participation in a democratic republic. And this is one of those tensions also in our democracy. Should our voting be more fair, or should it have more access? Those that want more access, of course, want to make voting easier. Those that want to make it more fair might actually make voting a little bit more difficult.
This also speaks to the concept of federalism and the idea that state and local governments have huge discretion on voting rules, whether it be stricter ID rules or making early voting easier. So good job, Kaylee.
We're going to take a question here from Twitter. David wants to know, could you explain the difference between a PAC and a super PAC and how the McCain-Feingold Act relates to them? Terrific. And he wants to shout out to his AP government teacher, Mr. Patton.
Hey, Mr. Patton. Shout out to Mr. Patton. And great question on campaign finance. We know that there was a 1970 law that established PACs, and PACs essentially can collect money, but it's limited money. PACs can collect money up to $5,000, and those PACs represent interest groups from the NRA, the National Restaurant Association, to the NRA, the National Rifle Association. And there's strict limits on how much they can collect. But then you have super PACs. Super PACs are sometimes called independent expenditure groups. And these are separate, maybe issue groups, or maybe they're separate groups that support a candidacy but not directly. Super PACs can raise and spend an unlimited amount of money. We call that soft money. McCain-Feingold took out the unlimited money donations to political parties. So no longer can you make soft money donations to political parties, but you can still donate to PACs, and you can donate an unlimited amount of money to super PACs.
David, the difference between PACs and super PACs is the difference between man and Superman. PACs, political action committees, smaller, less powerful. Super PACs, much larger, much more powerful. But the key distinction, as Mr. Canine has pointed out, limited money to PACs, unlimited money to super PACs, but super PACs cannot give to the candidates.
Let's talk a little bit about the actual test itself. How long do students have to complete the exam, and how should they manage their time on it?
Great question. So the multiple choice portion is 55 multiple choice questions. There's different styles of those multiple choice questions, and students have 80 minutes to complete it. So there probably won't be that much of a rush to read that quickly. So be careful, analyze the data carefully. Analyze the text. You'll see text excerpts, you'll see scenarios. Make sure you read carefully, and then go back and double check your work in the multiple choice.
So you have 55 multiple choice, 6 different types of questions. Look for data sets, look for passages, look for comparisons, scenarios. There'll be some trivia, not a lot, but there'll be some, and you'll have 80 minutes to answer those 55. Is that a lot of time? It's not a lot of time. Is it enough time? It's enough time. I think you can take your time, read carefully, and then those 4 FRQs, there'll be a brief break, then you'll come back for a 100-minute session, which is plenty of time to write your 4 FRQs. Remember, each of the FRQs are worth the same, 12.5% of the exam. So even though the short concept question, the first FRQ, appears short, and it is only 3 points, 3-point rubric, compared to the argumentative essay, the fourth essay, which has 6 points, but the first FRQ and the fourth FRQ are worth the same. Think less, ink more. Use the time redundantly restating the words in the prompts, drop data down from the data sets, talk about those Supreme Court cases by name over and over. And remember, when it says draw a conclusion, we're not drawing cartoons, we're saying because, or a conclusion that can be drawn because of this is. Be very redundant.
As we go through these questions, I want to inform our students out there that we actually have a couple of secret questions that will bring prizes. As your prize for getting these questions correct, we're going to get a copy of the U.S. Constitution signed by a Supreme Court justice. We have 3 different justices who signed constitutions for us this year: Justice Kagan, Justice Breyer, and Justice Gorsuch. So you want to participate in these practice questions because you could get a prize. So let's go to our next high school student. We're going to talk to Ian from Colbert, Washington. Ian, good morning.
Good morning. Could I give a shout out to my teacher?
Sure. You of course can. Go right ahead.
Okay. Shout out Mr. Beal for being an awesome AP Gov teacher, and also shout out to the couple students that are with us this morning watching this.
Early.
We all agree that. Okay. Do you have a question or do you want a study question?
I have a question. So, what is the most important thing about interest groups that we need to know?
Interest groups, one of my favorite topics because they become more and more important in a democracy. And they should be. They're protected by the First Amendment. Interest groups, unlike political parties who want to win elections, interest groups want to win issues. And so they find those issues that their membership is most concerned about, and it might be bipartisan. Interest groups support Democrats. They support Republicans. The same interest group, because they want to find access into the game. They want public policy access, and in many times actually write the public policy. Laws oftentimes are first written by interest groups, but they compete, and we call this pluralism, which is a big idea in this course, that we allow many competing interest groups, to compete over public policy.
Then you should also know that time and again, the courts have protected the rights of interest groups based particularly on the First Amendment, the right to free speech, the right to petition, and that often overlooked the right to assemble.
Did we say Federalist 10? One of the documents you need to know, and it might be on the argumentative essay. We all knew the dangers of interest groups. Madison and Hamilton wrote about it from the beginning. But here's the good news. They said the only way to assuage the danger of interest groups is to allow more interest groups competing. Pluralism.
Ian, do you want to try a practice question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Which of the following best summarizes Hamilton's argument in Federalist 71? A, the House of Representatives should have 4-year terms. B, 4-year terms and the power of judicial review help keep the judicial branch independent. C, U.S. senators should have 4-year terms. Or D, 4-year terms will help presidents enforce the law with limits on their ability to abuse powers.
Is it B?
Say your answer again.
B.
B as in boy?
Yes.
Sorry. This one is actually D. 4-year terms will help presidents enforce the law with limits on their abilities to abuse powers.
No, that's a good reminder. So that's going to be hard to do on TV really quick. But on Monday, you will have really much more time to read that passage and to infer and use critical thinking skills. On this exam, students have to know 9 foundational documents. And of those 9 documents, 4 of them are the Federalist Papers. But it is fair game on the exam that you will see an excerpt from a text. In this case, it could be from a different Federalist paper that's not required. But you'll see a short excerpt, but you'll have a lot more time to process that, to read that, and get that answer correct.
When you see a passage on this year's test in the redesigned exam, as the framework has told us, that the passage will always have 2 questions at least. The first question you'll be able to answer directly from just reading the passage. The second question will ask you to infer and apply a concept relating to what that passage is talking about. But take your time, read the passage, and don't panic. Don't say, Federalist 71, I don't know that. The answer's in the passage, and you'll get it from that point.
Let's take another question from our social media. Jax wants to know, do we need to know a lot about judicial restraint versus activism and the Warren Court? My government teacher loves to talk about that. Shout out to Mr. Dietrich.
Mr. Dietrich, great job. Warren's name will not appear in this exam. At least I don't expect it, but restraint and activism will.
You know, this is now 4 times that Mr. Larson's predicted that something will not be on the exam, and every time it ends up on the exam. So you better study your Warren Court. I always get nervous when he predicts something won't be on there. Judicial restraint and judicial activism, definitely fair game. And this is the idea that with the power of judicial review that the Federalists hinted at in Federalist 78, with the power of judicial review, the court has tremendous power to review the constitutionality of laws, to review the constitutionality of presidential actions. And in doing so, the court has to make a choice. Are they going to be active? Are they going to actively go out and overturn laws? Or are they going to show restraint and allow that state legislature or congressional legislation to stand?
Well, it's a great reminder of that case, Baker v. Carr. Because in Baker v. Carr, which is one of the 15 cases we need to know, one man, one vote, dealing with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but the Supreme Court enters into the political thicket, as they say. The justices were willing to recognize the Constitution as a living document, and the justices needed to go in to correct something that was wrong with our democratic process. This is activism, and it's a tension in our democracy today, and it speaks to one of our big ideas. You know, liberty versus order, for instance. Do we just take the First Amendment for what it says, or do we apply the First Amendment to a post-9/11 world where order may somehow conflict with our civil liberties? Oh, so much fun.
Let's go to Robbie, who's calling from Strongville, Ohio. Robbie, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing good. Do you have a question for us, or do you want a study question, or both?
Probably I'll do both.
Okay.
My question actually refers to the high school that I go to. It is a private Catholic high school, and during football games, sometimes we'll do prayer prayer over the public address system. But the public address system that we use is part of a public school district because we don't have our own field. I was wondering, under the Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe case, like, how would that case end up applying to what happens when we are doing our football games?
Robbie, a greasy question, and I'm going to go all in on it. We know one of the 15 court cases that will be on the test. They said these 15 are essential. Is Ingle Vitale in the early 60s, where the Supreme Court, clearly using the precedent from Everson, strict wall of separation between church and state, using the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, now applied to the states, selective incorporation, the Supreme Court in Ingle Vitale said public schools can no longer advocate for a prayer in their hallways, classrooms, or events. However, Robbie, because you attend a Catholic school, the Catholic school is not bound under the precedent in Ingle v. Vitale. I think it's possible we could see a case like that in the SCOTUS comparison FRQ, where they give a Catholic school scenario where prayer is allowed, and then they say, how does that scenario compare to Ingle v. Vitale? Robbie, you might just have hit the jackpot.
You really did, because you're guaranteed on that FRQ number 3 that you're going to be questioned about a Supreme Court case that you probably haven't studied. So as Mr. Larson just said, Ingle versus Vitale is one of the core 15 cases. And if you know that is an Establishment Clause case, and if you know that that premise then connects to a case like Santa Fe versus Doe, which is a really interesting case, that excerpt from Santa Fe versus Doe might be on the exam, but you've already kind of prepared yourself to make that connection, which is a great critical thinking skill.
And just as a reminder, and I know Mr. Fafaro and Mr. Fouts and our Hall of Fame teacher, Vanessa Lal, out there has already done this, but on those 15 essential Supreme Court cases, you should know 2 things: the constitutional principle, but also the context in which the case was decided. Study those. Constitutional principle and context.
And Robbie, you ready for your question?
Yep.
In a scenario in which the president is a Democrat, but Republicans have majority control of both the House and Senate, which statement is most likely to occur? A, an amendment would be passed and ratified to prevent this scenario from occurring. B, leaders of the two major parties would need to compromise to pass major legislation. C, Congress would not pass any legislation during that term. Or D, the president's legislative priorities would likely become law.
I would have to go with compromise. I think that was D.
B, you got it.
You got it. It was B, but you got it right.
Right. And Robbie, great work using those key words. So we didn't even use the word divided government in that question. That question's about divided government, and you know that to get policies passed with divided government, there has to be some element of compromise between the parties.
And we're seeing that right now with the president and a different party Congress talking about infrastructure this weekend. This is an example. Why wasn't the infrastructure bill passed when there was unified government? We can debate that later. But we know both sides need to claim some victories, and compromise is coming, and looks like there'll be more road signs this summer.
Let's talk to Terry, who's calling from Elk Grove, California. Terry, do you have a question for us, or do you want a study question? Or both?
I'll do a question.
You'll take a question, okay? Here's your question. Oh, you have a question, or you want a question?
I have a question.
Sorry. Well, go right ahead, Terry.
Okay, what do you think are the most important checks and balances on the legislature, executive, and judicial branch?
Checks
we
and
love
balances.
this question because we tell our students that going into the exam, the greatest thing you can do is come up with that list of checks and balances. You can't go wrong with knowing those constitutional principles, the separation of powers, and how the different branches check themselves. So some of the core checks and balances would be the idea that Congress, which is Article 1 in the Constitution, is given responsibility for writing the law. The executive branch, which is Article 2 of the Constitution, is given responsibility for actually implementing those laws. And then the judiciary, which is Article 3 of the Constitution, is given responsibility for interpreting those laws, or as we said with judicial review from the case of Marbury versus Madison, the idea that the courts can establish the constitutionality of laws. I'm sure Mr. Larson can give you about 25 more.
Let's not forget, however, that the Congress has the budget. The power of the purse is a tremendous check on the entire government. The president, and one that we don't talk a lot about, but it's not something unique to this president, we've seen it from the very beginning, is that presidents decide what to enforce, priorities in their enforcement of laws. And so this idea that presidents may not enforce some laws is a real check on the legislative branch. But for me, the biggest check on all three branches is we the people. It's the first three words of our Constitution. It's the most sacred bond that we have in a representative democracy, and that is we the people actually still and continue to have the power over both the Congress, the president, and even the courts.
Terry, you want to take a study question from us?
Yes. Can I also shout out a teacher?
Sure, go right ahead. Do that first.
I'd like to shout out my government teacher, Brian Benson.
All right.
Mr. Benson.
And here's your study question. What precedent was established in the Supreme Court case of McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819? A, the states could not tax the national government. B, in cases of conflict, state law would be supreme over national law. C, states could tax the national government. Or D, only state courts had the power to decide these type of cases.
Is it C?
Unfortunately, no.
It's A, and this is kind of tricky because we know McCulloch v. Maryland is about the supremacy of the national government. And here's that example of how to study both the constitutional principle and the context. The constitutional principle of McCulloch is the supremacy clause, that the national government is supreme over the states, but also that in this particular case, it was the city of Maryland, the state of Maryland, the city of Baltimore wanted to tax the national bank. And the Supreme Court, under the power of John Marshall, comes in and says, not gonna do it. The supremacy clause is what's supreme here in this case.
And Terry, that was one of our special questions. So we're going to send you one of our constitutions signed by
Neil Gorsuch.
Signed by one of our
Will
judges.
Smith, but it's Neil Gorsuch.
By Neil Gorsuch. Stay on the line and give your information, okay?
Thank you.
All right, let's go to Grace, who's calling from Powell, Ohio. Grace, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Can I shout out my Gov teacher?
Sure.
Sure, go right ahead.
Shout out to Mrs. Glover's AP government class.
What's your question, Grace?
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
I know that soft money was banned with the McCain-Feingold Act, but can you explain the difference between soft money and hard money?
Yeah, this is tough, Grace, but let me just try to make it simple. Let's try to make the complex simple and the confusing clear here. Hard money is directly given to the candidates, and it's severely limited. It's regulated by the FEC. Soft money is kind of a loophole. You can circumnavigate those strict limits by giving unlimited monies to independent groups. But here's the catch. Hard money to the candidates. Soft money cannot go to the candidates. But the soft money groups, those big super PACs, make ads, or they send out flyers, or hire people to go door to door to advocate for issues and candidates. They just can't be in tandem with candidates. Soft money, not candidates. Hard money to the candidates.
And then one of the core of 15 Supreme Court cases that connects with campaign finance and soft money is Citizens United versus FEC, which is a 2010 case where a majority of the Supreme Court said that corporations and labor unions can give an unlimited amount of money, so soft money, to independent expenditure groups or to super PACs. So that was a pivotal Supreme Court decision on campaign finance that you should know.
Let's take a question from our social media followers. Juan Cordova wants to know, what are the key points of monetary policy across the three branches that we should know? And also, he wants to shout out to Mr. Painter from Juan and Andrew.
Right.
Juan, you know, I've always said that fiscal and monetary policy aren't always covered on this exam, so I've really geared up for this. Speaking of which, we've also loaded up on our Instagram account more video and content on the framework, cram4.apgov, cram4.apgov. We go through all the essentials, and this is one of them. This is an essential knowledge point, knowing the difference between monetary and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, of course, is what governments do. They tax and they spend. Monetary policy, which has been in the news a lot as Donald Trump is trying to fill spots on the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, an independent government group dealing with interest rates and money supply, and it affects all the branches. The Supreme Court clearly makes decisions on the Federal Reserve and contracts and money. Of course, the president trying to be independent, but of course, good economic news is good for presidential reelection bids. And of course, the Congress writes laws about it.
And as Mr. Larson said, the president has indirect control of monetary policy by appointing members of the Federal Reserve Board, and those members who get to make decisions on interest rates, those members are approved by the U.S. Senate.
Let's take another question from our social media followers here, because I think this is one that we needed to get to. All right, Sydney Weiss wants to know, how will the multiple choice and FRQ sections be graded? If I do better on one, will my score from the other section hurt my overall grade? And she wants to shout out to Mr. Vicari from Richard Montgomery.
Good question, Sydney, and the mechanics of this exam are very important. The multiple choice section and the FRQ, the essay section, we're told are 50-50. The good news, however, is that you can, do a little bit less on the multiple choice, but if you crush your FRQs, of course you'll do better. Sometimes in some exams they kind of cross-reference and kind of crunch the numbers and spin, and this exam, do as best as you can in the multiple choice, but don't panic. You've got another section of FRQs to pick up your scores, or vice versa. You'll be fine. Take your time, read carefully, and your teacher's done a great job, as all of our teachers have.
One strategy that we've told our students is on the FRQ portion. Each of the 4 FRQs is worth 12.5% of the total grade. There's been a lot of attention paid to this newer FRQ called the argument essay. It's FRQ number 4, and it's worth 6 rubric points. But don't forget about particularly question number 1, the concept application, where you're going to be given an excerpt of a text. You have to apply that to 3 different questions. It's worth 3 points, but even though it's worth 3 rubric points, it's still worth 12.5% of the exam. So really try to maximize all of your points in the FRQ. And just because a question looks shorter doesn't mean you should spend less time really problem solving to maximize your points.
This may sound silly, but please go back and check that you've bubbled in carefully. Make sure you've actually answered. Thousands of students every year just leave questions blank. Not sure why. There is no penalty for wrong information. Go back and check your bubbles. Good practice for voting, too.
This is a good point where I can tell you about C-SPAN in the classroom. We want you to remember that you can always go to cspan.org/classroom, where you can find resources for teachers of social studies, economics, science, and other subjects. You can create and save your own video clips. And membership is free. So for more information and to register your account, visit cspan.org and look for cspan.org/classroom.
And that really is a great resource, particularly for the 15 required Supreme Court cases, the 9 historical documents. We know that they spent a lot of time pulling out film clips to help teachers and students. So C-SPAN in the classroom is a terrific prep resource for this exam.
Yeah. Let's talk to Cedric, who's calling from Knoxville, Tennessee. Cedric, you have a question for us? And do you want a practice question?
Can I get a practice question?
Well, let's go to the practice question then. Which of the following best describes a message from Dr. Martin Luther King letter from a Birmingham jail? A, the goals of anti-segregation protests upheld the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. B, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was inadequate legislation that needed strengthening. C, the war in Vietnam was unjust and disproportionately impacted African Americans. Or D, Americans of all races and ethnicities deserve fair wages and work benefits. What's your answer, Cedric?
Could you repeat them?
Okay, let's repeat them. I'll repeat the question and the options again. Which of the following best describes a message from Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail? A, the goals of anti-segregation protests upheld the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. B, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was inadequate legislation that needed strengthening. C, the war in Vietnam was unjust and disproportionately impacted African Americans. Or D, the Americans of all races and ethnicities deserved fair wages and work benefits.
All right, I'm going to go with A.
Cedric, A it is. It reminds us again how the letter from a Birmingham jail is one of the 9 fundamental documents. We'll see a passage, I think, on the test. We might even see a passage in the concept application, FRQ. The letter from a Birmingham jail is a critical, big idea document that speaks to participation in a democratic republic. Martin Luther King said, let's not wait. Civil rights is now, and it's the ideals of our Declaration.
And he really did work to connect those ideals with the founding ideals, particularly in Jefferson's Declaration.
Let's take another question from our social media followers. Allie Burris wants to know, can you explain the clauses of the 14th Amendment?
Oh.
And shout out to Mr. Spruill and Mr. Notch from First Colonial High School.
Great question, Allie. So one of the key that we were just talking about with the civil rights and Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, one of the key clauses is the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is particularly connected with one of those core Supreme Court cases, Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended racial segregation in public schools. So you have to know that case, Brown versus the Board of Education, and you should really know that that case is connected with the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which is used in many of the civil rights court cases.
Another clause, of course, is the Due Process Clause. We call in our class the 14th Amendment as the Second Constitutional Convention, because both the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause recalibrated the power of the national government. As Andy's pointed out, the Equal Protection Clause uplifted civil rights as a national priority, and the national government would be the arbiter of that. Due process, how exciting is this? Remember, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states until the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment was interpreted in 1925, mind you, in Gitlau versus New York, that the fundamental privileges of citizens should be applied to all through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. We call this selective incorporation. And on our list of 15 cases, the Gideon case is our example of selective incorporation, where the court used the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to apply the 6th Amendment's right to an attorney, a lawyer, to the states. What a great question, and we will see a number of due process, equal protection applications on Monday's test.
And we should also add that the Due Process Clause was used in McDonald versus Chicago in the Second Amendment case.
What does it take to get a perfect score on this exam?
Shazam! You know, we're not looking for perfection. You know, let's not make good the enemy of the great here. Listen, do your best. You've got 300,000 students across the country taking this exam. And in the end, this is the good news. In the end, it's not the score that's the winner here. It's the student who's the winner. We know that students taking that test on Monday are disproportionately more likely to finish college, which means you'll be disproportionately more likely to get into the middle class and have a bright future. Boy, just standing in line on Monday to get ready to take this test, to me, that's a perfect score.
But really, in the perfect civics lesson that all of our students can learn is that this is really more than a course. This is more than a civics course. It's really a lifestyle. It's a civics lifestyle. And those perfect lessons are actually those moments when our students go out of the classroom, be engaged citizens, learn how to think critically and read news critically, go to different sources, learn how to develop arguments, learn how to support those arguments with evidence, learn what the other side is saying and counter arguments, and be able to respond to those counter arguments. Those lessons of citizenship are the perfect lessons.
Let's talk to Kira, who's calling from Virginia Beach, Virginia. Kira, do you have a question, and do you want a study question?
Hi, I actually have a question, but quick shout out to Mr. Sproul and Mr. Naki. My question is, when would a pocket veto be used, and is it considered an informal or formal power of the executive branch?
What a great question. So I'm going to let Mr. Larson answer whether it's a formal or informal power. I'm going to give him time to think about that. A pocket veto, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, is a president's power to be able to reject legislation that's passed at the end of a congressional term. In the Constitution, Congress is able to pass laws, and it says very clearly that a president has 10 days to sign that law. And you know that if a president doesn't sign that legislation, it automatically becomes a law. However, Congress often works like a second semester senior. They push their work off till the very end. And a lot of times that legislation's passed with less than 10 days left in their terms. In those cases where bills are passed with less than 10 days left, if a president doesn't sign that legislation, it's considered to be a pocket veto, and that legislation never becomes law. So unlike an ordinary veto, where an ordinary presidential veto would go back to both chambers of Congress, and they could override the presidential veto with a 2/3 support, very rare, a pocket veto cannot be, it just doesn't become law.
Kira, I'm glad you brought up this question, because I think the argumentative essay, I didn't write it, but if I did, I would talk about formal and informal powers in the public policy making process. As Mr. Coninas pointed out, if it is not in the Constitution, it's an informal power. And what a great tension we have in today's government, wrestling between the formal powers of the Constitution versus the informal. And no branch has done this more than the presidential branch. The executive branch, the president, most of his powers today are through the informal powers. Think about executive orders. Has the power of law, no congressional vote. Think about executive agreements, the power of a treaty, but no Senate approval. Think about the president's choosing whether or not to enforce a law, or those signing statements where a president can sign into law, but then as he's signing that bill into law, says, well, I'm going to enforce this part a little bit differently than this part. These informal powers have made our president so much more powerful, and the public policy making process has become different.
Kira, do you want a practice question?
Yes, please.
All right, here's yours. Which of these are the most accurate descriptions of Federalist 51 and Federalist 70? A, Federalist 51 advocated for the independence of judges, and Federalist 70 explained how large republics could balance factions. B, Federalist 51 summarized how checks and balances would work in the Constitution, and Federalist 70 expressed a need for an executive branch that was energetic. C, Federalist 51 explained the need of an electoral college, and Federalist 70 described the powers of the House of Representatives. Or D, Federalist 51 promoted the appointment of U.S. senators by state legislatures, and Federalist 70 summarized the formal powers of a president. Kira, which one do you think is correct?
B.
B it is. Great job, Kira. Federalist 51 is one of the essential documents. It's checks and balances. That Federalist 70, however, also an essential document, a little tricky because Hamilton uses the word energetic president. This has nothing to do with a president using the RBG workout plan. This has to do with a president who can act unilaterally with energy. There's a crisis, got to do something. Is it any wonder then that all of our presidents are looking for emergencies and crises, because then they can act without Congress and they can act boldly.
And Kira, you're going to see several questions on the exam that are formatted like that. They're called comparison questions, and they're going to be formatted like a grid, and essentially they become a true-false question where you're looking for the row that has two true statements. And so great job.
Let's go to Felix, who's calling from Bethesda, Maryland. Felix, good morning.
Hi. I just want to say thank you so much to my teachers, Mrs. Young and Mrs. Johnston, for preparing us like so well for the exam.
Thanks, Felix.
My question is, how did the USA Freedom Act change the law from the Patriot Act?
So, great question. We know, in addition to that, you might be asked about FISA. So we know there's a series of laws, particularly when it comes to liberty and order, that most of which were passed after September 11th, 2001. But the FISA Act was actually passed in the late 1970s. And all these laws have kind of a common purpose. And you should probably know the common purpose rather than the specific differences between the legislation. And the common purpose is that all these laws gave the national government increasing power, and in some cases murkiness, to be able to conduct investigations. So the USA Patriot Act was particularly controversial after 9/11 because it gave the FBI and some intelligence agencies more power to do investigations without notifying people of search warrants and without notifying people of those investigations. And then you're right, the USA Freedom Act changes that because a lot of these legislation, because they're controversial with, in some cases, kind of going into liberty or reducing liberty, Congress often puts what's called sunset provisions on that legislation. A sunset provision means that parts of that bill are going to expire after a certain amount of time, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, and it gives Congress a chance to go back, relook at that legislation, look at how that legislation's been implemented because it was controversial, to make amendments, and the USA Freedom Act was essentially part of that review process.
Felix, I know there are a lot of students out there right now panicking over, wait a minute, I have to know the names of legislation? Oh, well, this is going to be trouble. Relax. The essential knowledge points have pointed out what those laws we should know. Right. And there are not a lot, but there are a few. Two that we haven't mentioned yet today, but make sure you know these laws by name. They will be on multiple choice. I wouldn't be surprised if they were in the FRQs. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Boy, I'm expecting those in the multiple choice, and I would love to see them in the FRQs as well. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 took down those Jim Crow laws, that ability for some areas to segregate based on race. No longer. And the Voting Rights Act, making voting more welcoming to marginalized minority groups. Those laws we should know.
We should add another law that could likely be on the test is Title IX, which is part of a 1972 law that ends gender discrimination in public schools. A lot of times we know that, you might know that from equal funding of high school sports between boys and girls sports, but a huge part of Title IX was actually saying that you had to take down those requirements that your grandmothers might have had in public school, that the grandmothers had to take a home ec course or a typing course while your grandfathers didn't. That kind of gender discrimination in public schools is invalidated because of Title IX.
Felix, ready for a practice question?
I'm ready.
All right. Which of these Federalist Papers is best matched to a description? A, Federalist 10 described the powers of the House of Representatives. B, Federalist 51 explained how large republics could balance factions. C, Federalist 70 implies the need for judicial review. Or D, Federalist 78 advocated for the independence of judges.
And Felix, not to put pressure on you, but if you get this correct, you get not one but two pocket constitutions, one for yourself and one for your teacher. So pressure's on, Felix.
Awesome. I'm going to go with D, Federalist 78 advocate.
Great job.
And Felix, Federalist 78 is one of the essential documents that we need to know for Monday's test. But again, some of my students struggle with that word independent judiciary. It's a political science term, but what does it mean? It means that the judiciary, at least according to political scientists, should be independent from politics. We see this through life terms of our justices. Our justices are not elected. They're chosen by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and we hope they're independent of the political process. But boy, as we've witnessed in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings this past year, seems a little bit more political than the framers thought. That least dangerous branch may be a little bit more dangerous.
And then Felix, Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer signed these two-pocket constitutions, and Justice Kagan added a exam tip for you and every AP government student out there, where she added the note, read this well. And obviously you've been reading well the Federalist Papers and the Constitution. Great work.
Felix, stay on the line so we can get your contact information, okay?
Thank you. Sure.
All right, let's take another caller. Let's go to Grace, who's calling from Lakewood, Ohio. Grace, good morning. Grace, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Do you have a question for us, Grace?
I do. Thank you so much. I would like to shout out Mr. Shannon from St. Joseph Academy. And my question is, how do iron triangles relate to the current state of bureaucracy?
Well, Grace,
Bring
another
out the
call.
mushroom
First of all, another
examples.
call from Ohio. As Ohio goes, so goes Cram for the Exam. And this is now year 11 with Mr. Larson and I being on Cram for the Exam, and it's also year 11 for an iron triangle question. No better place to look at iron triangles than food regulation. And usually Mr. Larson makes fun of me because I have some examples about green beans or mushrooms. But there was actually a recent news story in the last 2 weeks about food regulation involving the regulation of cherry pies.
Yes.
And the idea that the Food and Drug Administration, which has bureaucratic discretion over food regulations, has said that they are going to change a 1977 standard that said that every cherry pie, a frozen cherry pie sold at the grocery store, had to be sold with, that had to be made with at least 25% cherries by weight, and at least 85% of those cherries had to be unblemished. So the FDA has said, the FDA is not going to regulate cherry pies like that. Well, that decision was made relatively quickly. It got some attention, but it really wasn't controversial. We assume that in the Iron Triangle, you had the FDA as the executive branch implementing the law. We know that Congress for 100 years has passed different food regulation laws. So that's the other part of the Iron Triangle, that the Congress passing the law. And then the third part of the Iron Triangle is interest groups. In this case, the American Bakers Association was working with probably members of Congress or a staffer from Congress along with the FDA to say, hey, can't we ease up these regulations on cherry pies? Now that contrasts with issue networks. Issue networks are more controversial. And so it's interesting that, I don't know if you drink soy milk or almond milk or regular milk, but there's a big debate in the milk community as to whether soy and almond milk should be called milk, whether these plant-based milks. And we know that interest groups like the American Dairy Association are really upset with the idea of soy milk being labeled milk or almond milk. And that's really controversial. That's much more of an example of an issue network because you have a lot of different interest groups in there, and it's a more controversial decision. And so it's interesting that the FDA isn't tackling the milk labeling issue because that's an issue network. And we know that issue networks take more time to go through the policymaking process because there are more voices and it's more controversial. But iron triangles, fast, tends not to be controversial. You tend not even to read about it, but we know there was a recent news story about the cherry pie regulation.
Grace, I don't know much about pie, but I can make the iron triangle question cake on Monday. The 3 points of the triangle are a congressional committee, an executive agency, and an interest group, and it speaks to the competing interests in public policy.
Grace, do you want a study question? Grace, can you hear me?
She was driven asleep by the pie response.
All right, let's go to Tristan, who's calling from Elizabeth, Colorado. Tristan, good morning.
Blemished cherry.
Good morning.
Do you have a question for us, or do you want a study question?
Yeah, I do, but can I just shout out my AP teacher real quick?
Please, go right ahead.
So I'd like to shout out Miss Gable, so my 7th period AP government teacher. She's the best.
All right, Ms. Gable.
And yes. So I do have a question for you guys. So I was just wondering, how does log rolling apply to government and everything else?
Log rolling is one of the essential words. I found it on the essential knowledge list, and so it's in my deck of cards. Log rolling is an old political science term dealing with vote trading. The idea that if you vote for me, I'll vote for you, but it really speaks to the issue of bargaining and compromise. Back when our political process maybe was a little bit more efficient and maybe worked a little bit better than we see it now, but it really still goes on. Let's not forget, as much as we read about gridlock, our Congress and our president still work. Our budgets are passed, money is being spent, and to a great extent, it's because of log rolling, trading of favors and compromising and bargaining together.
And obviously, log rolling is a metaphor that's usually connected with a different metaphor, and that's pork barrel spending, or the fancy word for that is federal earmarks. And this is the idea, and it's kind of going out of date. Maybe it's going to return with an infrastructure bill, but it's the idea that when Congress is trying to pass legislation, one of the ways that they can grease up that legislation and get it through easier is with pork, or these local spending projects that essentially representatives might all want to attach to a bill. And if they all have an incentive to vote for that bill, it makes it more likely to pass that bill if it's filled with pork barrel projects. And that would be an example of log rolling. Sometimes that Latin phrase is used with log rolling, a quid pro quo, this for that. Sometimes they use a mathematical phrase for log rolling, reciprocity.
All right, let's see if we can get one more quick study question in for, let's talk to Mackenzie from Lake Stevens, Washington. Mackenzie, are you there?
Hi. Can I shout out my AP Gov teacher?
You can. Go right ahead.
Shout out to Mr. Heyman. So my question was if you could, it's actually a little bit about iron triangles, but I was wondering if you could explain how interest groups affect legislation and policy implementation, and then maybe talk a little bit about grassroots lobbying.
Oh, I love the term grassroots. Again, another metaphor. Mr. Canine loves metaphors. But grassroots is a word that you'll see, I believe, on the test. And it speaks also to that big idea, participation in a representative democracy. The grassroots, different than interest groups, which tends to be more formalized, more professional, more big budget. Interest groups oftentimes more corporate. Grassroots is when you and I, everyday citizens, pick up our bootstraps, go out into the streets, knock on doors, send out mailers, make phone calls, call our congressman. Grassroots. And again, some of the most effective interest group activity that there is.
Well, That's true, but one of the most effective interest group activities actually happens on Capitol Hill every business day, and that's testifying before committees. And so a lot of times interest groups will have experts go up before a hearing on a specific committee, and they'll testify. And that makes a difference because members of Congress want to hear from experts. And that's really what interest groups do when they're doing it best, is they have information that nobody else knows about that policy or about that legislation, and they provide that information to members of Congress. Maybe it's through a personal contact. A lot of times it's through testimony in a hearing to help shape opinions.
Well, this has been a great segment. I have absolutely loved this. We would like to thank Daniel Larson and Andrew Caneen from Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois, for coming in and helping us get these students ready for the High School Advanced Placement U.S. exam on Monday. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Thank you.
And good luck to all of our students out there taking the exam. Once again, join us again tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. for another episode of Washington Journal. Good luck on the test, students, and everybody have a good weekend.
Here's some of the C-SPAN program schedule today. Next, the Deputy Defense Secretary for the Middle East talks about U.S. policy in the region, particularly Syria, Iran, and Iraq. After that, Attorney General William Barr's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the Mueller report. Then, Senate debate to override President Trump's veto last month of a resolution calling for an end to U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. They fell short of the 67 votes needed to override the veto. And following the Senate debate, a hearing on the humanitarian crisis in Syria.
Sunday night on Q&A, Lincoln scholar Harold Holzer and best-selling author Amity Shlaes. They'll share their perspectives on C-SPAN's new book, The Presidents. Noted historians rank America's best and worst chief executives. Sunday night at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A.
Once, TV was simply 3 giant networks and a government-supported service called PBS. Then, in 1979, a small network with an unusual name rolled out a big idea. Let viewers decide, all on their own, what was important to them. C-SPAN opened the doors to Washington policymaking for all to see, bringing you unfiltered content from Congress and beyond. In the age of power to the people, this was true people power. In the 40 years since, the landscape has clearly changed. There's no monolithic media, broadcasting has given way to narrowcasting, YouTube stars are a thing. But C-SPAN's big idea is more relevant today than ever. No government money supports C-SPAN. Its nonpartisan coverage of Washington is funded as a public service by your cable or satellite provider. On television and online, C-SPAN is your unfiltered view of government, so you can make up your own mind.
Next, a forum on U.S. policy in the Middle East, focusing on Syria, Iran, and Iraq. Here's Deputy Defense Secretary Michael Mulroy's remarks at the event, hosted by the Center for a New American Security.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Welcome to Center for New American Security. My name is Ilan Goldenberg. I run the Middle East Security Program here at CNAS. And today, we're going to spend a couple of hours talking about the future of the Middle East, and specifically, how we think about American policy in the context of, the aftermath of at least the end of the ISIS caliphate, but obviously, ISIS very much remains a factor, as we saw just last week in Sri Lanka, and also looking more broadly at the region and all the various challenges we face. we have, as part of this event, we're rolling out 2 new CNAS reports. The first, Solving the Syrian Rubik's Cube, an instruction guide for leveraging Syria's fragmentation to achieve U.S. policy objectives. We have long subtitles. That's how we like to roll here. And that was written by my colleague Nick Harris and my colleague Kaylee Thomas, and we'll have a whole panel that dives deeper on what happens, what we do next in Syria, and really looks at sort of 6 options ultimately for American policy in Syria based on the level of commitment that the United States wants to make and the level of investment the United States wants to make, as well as also looking at the question of how we want to, what kind of posture we want to take towards Bashar al-Assad. The second report, Slow and Steady, Improving U.S.-Arab Cooperation to Counter Irregular Warfare, builds on a lot of research in the past on why efforts for the United States to work together with its Arab partners have failed in this capacity, especially in dealing with the challenges posed by Salafi jihadists, and also challenges posed by Iran as sort of this, below the high-level conventional conflict and much more at the lower level asymmetric warfare questions. And so we'll have an opportunity also with a great panel to discuss that. But before we do any of that, we have an excellent keynote speaker here, and what we're going to do is have a little bit of a chat, myself and him. We have Mick Mulroy, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Mick runs OSD Policy Middle East, which is an office I served in for a few years, and we were talking about before, really includes everything from Egypt to Iran. One of the most important and influential, I think, offices inside OSD policy, and frankly in the U.S. government, looking at this very challenging set of questions that keeps the office incredibly busy and keeps people who work there, as I can tell you from experience, working very long hours sometimes under constant pressure and unpredictable things that come in. Mick is a retired paramilitary operations officer who used to work for the CIA. He had a number of overseas assignments during his distinguished career, a number of very senior overseas assignments. And his awards include the Intelligence Star, the Intelligence Commendation Medal, the Career Intelligence Medal, and the National Intelligence Exceptional Achievement Medal, among others. So obviously he's somebody who knows how to work and deal with challenges in conflict regions, and in some of the challenges facing the Middle East. He was really a perfect person for this type of position. With that, welcome, Mick. Great to have you here. I'll start by asking you a question, really at the meta level, which is to say, talking about the Middle East in Washington seems a little passé these days now. Everything's about great power competition. It's about the national defense strategy. It's about shifting to China and Russia. But we still have real interests in the Middle East. We can't give those up. And how do we think about those? And how do you think about, the overall region and how you try to protect American interests in this environment where it looks like or at least there's a lot of debate about potentially pulling back?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me, Elon, and thanks for everybody else that came out today. I think we're talking about the Middle East. We should probably start with, as you already referenced, the National Defense Strategy, which, as you know, came from the National Security Strategy, which is issued in 2017, and then the next year we had the NDS, the National Defense Strategy. It does, as you mentioned, prioritize Russia and China as our near-peer competitors, then North Korea and Iran as rogue state actors, and then lastly, our priorities is now counterterrorism. So I would say a few things. It's not the first time that we've tried to pull away from the Middle East in counterterrorism. 2001, obviously before the 9/11 attacks, and then 2011. But that's the priorities, and we are committed to implementing in that order. When it comes to the Middle East, though, Russia and China actually play a very active part in the Middle East. So part of the dialogue we're trying to inject into this is it's not just geographic. In other words, if you're going to send resources just to geographic regions, that might not be the most effective way to push back against the influence of Russia and China, particularly if they're building bases in Africa and the Middle East. But specifically toward Iran, and I know you wanted me to focus on that. The threats that we look at that come from Iran primarily exist in 5 spheres. The first one is the concern that they would get a nuclear weapon, the first one. We obviously have plans to prevent that from happening, and the president's been fully clear in his intent not to let that happen. The second part is the maritime security, which for folks that are familiar with the region, you have the Straits of Hormuz and you have the Bab el-Mandeb. A substantial portion of our energy trade and commercial goods period go through those straits. The Iranians are constantly threatening those. We, of course, have plans to make sure that that doesn't happen, and we keep those trade routes open. The third threat, and Secretary Mattis used to hold his hands up when he did this, was 5 of them, is their support to proxies and terrorist organizations. So I know we're going to go more into detail on that, but that would include Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis, some of the al-Shabi units in Iraq, and of course their housing and safe harboring senior al-Qaeda leaders. So those are other issues that I'm sure we'll get into. The fourth one is the ballistic missile threat, which we see emanating from areas of Houthi control in Yemen toward our allies in Saudi Arabia, which there's a substantial amount of American citizens present. And then, of course, on the border with Israel, all the advanced weapon systems that they have there and their spread is of high concern. And then the last one I'd point out is cyber. Cyber is something that comes up in literally every discussion about anything now. From my perspective, having started my career in the agency right around the time of September 11th, CT was something that was very fragmented, and
is that working?
I don't know. Yeah, okay, it's working. And then we figured out how to work together as interagencies. I see that happening now in cyber, is why I bring that up. We have somebody specifically dedicated to cyber, so it's not me. But I see that kind of the growing page that is going through right now with us on that.
Sure. So maybe just to dive a little bit deeper on Iran, and part of the, I don't want to get into a long discussion on the nuclear question. I really want to focus on the regional question, which is the one that I think many in the region focus on. Even if from the American perspective, I think the nuclear still remains, the first and foremost global priority. But on the regional question, one of the things that we talk about in one of our reports, especially on the Arab Irregular Warfare report, is we've had one administration after another come in and say, and both Democrats and Republicans, and say, we're going to push back against Iranian behavior in the region. We're going to figure out how to deter. We're going to, stop their, use of militias. But hasn't really worked thus far. It's a pretty cheap tool, and it's one they've been, able to use pretty effectively in places like Iraq against us, places like Syria, where they've been hugely supportive of Bashar al-Assad, in places like Yemen to some extent. And so, what can we actually do to be more effective against this challenge? How are you guys thinking about that?
So we can get into the maximum pressure campaign that's run by the State Department, but I'd start with the way that the DoD approaches the problem, which is largely in 4 bins. The first one's plans. We are, as a CIA person, I was uber impressed with how much the military plans for everything, and Iran's no exception. So there are plans to do essentially everything: defend our key allies, to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons, from opening the Straits of Hormuz, and obviously responding to any kind of aggression. And that's continuous. And General Votel spent a lot of time on that, and General McKenzie, his replacement down at Central Command, is also dedicated to that. The next one I would say is, and I know we're going to get into MESA, the Middle East Strategic Alliance, is building partnerships, because that's what the NDS essentially requires us to do, to build up our partnerships. And I'll save most of the discussion on that for that. Our posture, we have bases throughout the Middle East. We are on bases with our key allies throughout the Middle East. That limits the Iranian freedom of movement. It protects the key straits, the key choke points of maritime trade. And it's very important in that regard. I know we get a lot of questions, so I'll go ahead and answer one of them. We are committed to the NDS. The NDS does prioritize Russia and China, and any strategy that prioritizes should allocate resources accordingly. So there is a shifting of resources. But the one thing I would add to that is the United States is by far the most capable when it comes to expeditionary warfare and the ability to project power anywhere in the world to great effect. So that and our what we call dynamic force employment, where we routinely have forces show up in an area that may not be expected, shows our ability to do that. So when it comes to shifting forces, that's something that we do to make up for it.
Yeah, and something we always used to, when I was at DoD, we used to try to remind ourselves, working on the Iran problem in particular, that the Iranians are not 10 feet tall. Like, we're still quite capable of doing a lot of different things at once. I want to shift us a little bit to Syria and Iraq, because that's another one of the focuses, especially of the report that Nick and Kaylee put out, which I think will actually officially come out, I think, while we're all sitting here at some point this afternoon. But we've had the defeat of the caliphate itself, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about where things go in Syria and in Iraq going forward. And so, how are you guys thinking about this now? What are you most worried about and concerned about? Is it Syria, is it Iraq? How are you thinking about long-term American presence in a place like Iraq and Syria? Maybe you can walk us through the latest in terms of what DoD and the administration are considering as they look at these questions.
Yeah, and I would agree with your paper that the model that we used in Syria is a good model for future activities. Essentially, a relatively small contingent of U.S. forces paired with a very capable and willing partner, in this case the Syrian Defense Forces, supported and enabled by our air support, our combat advisors, and our combat logistics, which is actually sometimes the most important part of the partnership as far as our support, paired with a diplomatic effort, which was Brett McGurk and Bill Roebuck, and now it's Jim Jeffrey and Joel Rayburn. So paired with them, and then followed eventually by stabilization. I know we have a whole section on that, and I'd love to get into it. But I would highlight that is a good model, and it's not the only time we've used that. At the beginning of Afghanistan with the Northern Alliance, small groups of special forces and CIA officers, and then in Iraq, essentially the same model with the Kurdish Peshmerga that did Operation Viking Hammer at the beginning of the war and then became the Northern Front against Saddam. So that model is very effective, and I think that is something to be highlighted. On the good part of it, 40,000 square miles were liberated, 10 million people were pulled out of the grip of ISIS, and that is something that I think we should really highlight. However, there's no victory dances going on at the Pentagon. We lost 14 people in that fight. Our SDF partners told us they've lost 11,000. The UN estimates up to 400,000 Syrians died, and 5.5 million people fled. It is a good thing that ISIS no longer controls territory, but there was a lot of cost that I think would subdue any type of celebration necessarily. Some of the things lessons learned, I think, that came out of this and that we'll deal with going ahead, and something we're still dealing with is the foreign terrorist fighters. So we have a non-state actors with limited resources that has over 1,000 foreign terrorist fighters that come from 50 different countries. I don't think the international community should sit on the sidelines and just watch them deal with this. I think there's a responsibility of the international community to step up and take their citizens back. So that's one thing that I definitely, I don't know if that's necessarily lessons learned, but it's certainly something that I think is important.
And in terms of, way forward, especially, I'd say, well, both, maybe also talking about Iraq and the way forward in Iraq. How do you see that? Obviously, we have a pretty challenging situation, but also one where, at least where I pull back, I sort of look at Iraq and I say, this is, in some ways, this is kind of a good news story. Yes, it's complicated. It's hard. We got Iranian influence. You have American influence. There's a lot of competition going on. You have the Gulf states increasingly re-engaging. How are you guys? I know DoD spends a lot of time thinking about long-term stability of Iraq. What are you thinking there in terms of and how you're engaging with the Iraqi government?
Yeah, and I'll take part of your last question and this question, because you asked me what we worry about the most. And I think it's important to note that the physical caliphate is defeated, but ISIS is not. So there's upwards around 10,000 ISIS fighters and support elements within Syria and Iraq, and they are completely unrepentant. And that's something that we intend to or expect to deal with for many years to come. So this is transition to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, but I would say that in a way that doesn't minimize how important that is, because it's not going away. And also Idlib. Idlib is essentially the largest collection of al-Qaeda affiliates in the world right now. We have very limited insights into what's going on. It is, to your question, something we worry about a great deal. Specifically to Iraq, a lot of us in the DoD and my former organization spent a lot of time in Iraq building up their security forces. And I think they can be proud of the effort that went into that. They especially the counterterrorism service, just to highlight one in particular, has really proven that effort was worth it. And they've spent a considerable amount of time ridding their country with our support, but they did it of ISIS. Long-term stability, I think it's important that we're there. I think our presence in Iraq is hugely significant and one of the biggest factors when it comes to U.S. influence in the Middle East. And we're there alongside the GOI. We're there at their request from the Strategic Framework Agreement we signed 10 years ago. So I think we are part of that. I think we are part of ensuring that their military and their security services are capable of defending the sovereignty of the government of Iraq.
And you think also in Syria, would you say the same thing? You think we're there and at this point looking at a long-term continued commitment to try to maintain the stability there?
Right, and this is something that Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who is our special envoy for Syria, says a lot. We're not in a bad situation there. I know that's a strange thing to say considering this, everything that's gone on in Syria, but we have a very capable partner. They have the territory that controls a lot of the oil resources and the arable land for agriculture, and we are there with them. And we do expect to be there for the long haul. And our presence, although military presence is only there to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, it does provide our diplomats influence, right? When they are, because we have several objectives in Syria, only one of them is defeat of ISIS, but when it comes to pushing for the UN Resolution 2254, that process to go forward, which Ambassador Jeffrey is at the helm, having us there, both in the Northeast and down in Antonov Garrison, does provide them leverage. When it comes to pushing back against the Iranian-controlled militias that are in Syria that really have a threat to a lot of our allies, our presence is not there for that, but our presence does allow us a lot of influence when it comes to dealing with the consequences.
Sure. So I wanted to shift again as we're doing this tour of the region. And I know Yemen is an area that you focused on a lot yourself, and you've been there a number of times. And so, maybe you can tell, obviously Yemen is an issue that in Washington gets a lot of attention. And there's, a lot of concern in Congress about, the Saudi-led campaign, as well as, I think, concern that, quite frankly, that the American administration has given the Saudis almost a concern, a blank check to do what they'd like in Yemen, which has been problematic. But I wonder what your assessment is of the current situation there, from your trips there, and sort of how we're trying to approach this with our Arab partners.
That's correct. I do spend a lot of time on Yemen, and I think as a short aside, I am in this position because they were looking for somebody who had spent a lot of time in conflict areas. So if I have a specialty, that's actually it. It was they were looking for an apolitical person to do that. So my travel schedule kind of relates to that. So I've spent a lot of time in Syria, in Iraq, and the Egyptian Sinai, and Yemen. And I just was in Yemen last week. So a couple of points on that. We support UNSCR 2216, as you'd expect, 100%. The only answer for Yemen is a peaceful solution and an end to the conflict that's caused such a tremendous humanitarian problem there. Secretary Mattis, myself, my team has a very strong relationship with the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffith. We support him and his team, particularly Lieutenant General Losgaard, who is the man on the ground in Hudaydah. They are pushing for the Stockholm Agreement to be implemented. I think a lot of us would have liked to see that happen faster, and there's a lot of concern that the Houthis, quite frankly, haven't lived up to their agreements that they made specifically in Stockholm. But they keep pushing, and we hope that they see that it's in their best interest to relieve the stress that's in Hudaydah and to make sure that there's never a cutting off of humanitarian aid that goes through that main port into the northern parts of the country. I would say we certainly spent a lot of time discussing the issues with the Saudi-led coalition, and I'll talk a little bit about CT, but we'll start with Houthi issues. The Houthis are supported by Iran. They provide them weapons. We have a Iran material display right here in one of our bases if you ever want to get to it. There's analysts that specialize in it. They can explain exactly why we know they come from Iran, but we're very confident and clear that that's what's going on. They also provide funds and oil. But the concerns on the Hill, there's basically two pieces of legislation that we've been up there to brief them on. The first one is the War Powers Resolution, the Senator Sanders and Senator Lee. That's specifically about U.S. not being involved in combat operations. We don't think we are involved in combat operations. We don't refuel aircraft anymore. We stopped that last year. The only thing we do now is essentially side-by-side coaching to help mitigate civilian casualties, teach them our techniques to basically strike who you're going after and not strike who you don't want to. So obviously innocent civilians. And enforce the law of armed conflict to push for real investigations that lead to real change. That's all that's left that we do. If you look at that legislation or the Saudi Accountability and Yemeni Act, I don't think this is their intent, but if that should pass in a level that's above the veto, then essentially all they would cut off is our coaching them, the Saudi-led coalition, try to avoid civilian casualties. I'm sure that's not what they intend, but I don't see, that's the way I see it. I see that if that happens, that is obviously not helping the situation.
So do you think there's things that we could do with the Saudis that would try to improve the situation, or at least lead to a better outcome or approach to how they're dealing with the conflict? Or maybe it sort of starts to lean into the next question in our second report, which really talks about how we work more effectively with our Arab partners.
So first I would like to continue our efforts to work in their joint force command. We have Americans there working side by side. But what I would like to highlight is the need to start focusing on the Yemeni people. The Yemeni people are moving out with everything that they need to do to try to take their country from a failed state to, say, a fragile state, which is obviously a move in the right direction. When I was in Aden, I met with a new prime minister who has just been appointed and endorsed by the parliament. I met with most of his staff. It's the first time I met him, but I would say my impressions are highly motivated people who really want to do the right thing for their country. They want to start building their own security forces, both the border, both Coast Guard and local security forces, to prevent the flow of weapons into their country and obviously secure the population. I met with the Civil Action group that literally came from all over the country, some driving for 2 days, to talk about what they want to see done in their country. And I think their voice needs to be more heard. We're also, and this is something that was started by the previous secretary, working with the UN on a comprehensive plan that would look how to assist the people of Yemen by building an international plan, a comprehensive plan that focuses on economic development, political grassroots efforts, local political efforts, and building up the Yemeni security forces. And we spent a lot of time trying to get funding to do just that. And that's something that really hope will take shape.
So I want to sort of pivot us to one more topic that I want to dive into. It's working okay? All right, and which is working with our Arab partners, which we sort of mentioned too. And I mean, one of the things we found, one of the reasons we undertook the second report was because our experience has been that there's a lot of struggles and a lot of challenges with trying to be, with all these different challenges, whether it's Syria or Iraq or Yemen, these different conflict zones. The role of the U.S. military working together with Arab militaries has been mixed at best. And I was there, I was at DoD 10 years ago, and we were trying to get, our Gulf partners to coordinate more effectively on missile defense and maritime security and counterterrorism and all these things, and we're still trying to basically do that. And so I'd be interested to get, your take on, we now have this Middle East Strategic Alliance. That's the latest initiative. But it's another effort, like similar efforts that have been tried in the past. I'm curious to get your take on how well that is going, what you guys are trying to do, and what kind of success you think you can have.
Yeah, and to your point, this isn't the first time it's been tried, and there's a reason behind it because it's important. So the Middle East Strategic Alliance, from our perspective, from the U.S. perspective, we want this to be a holistic agreement. And by that I mean we want an economic part, we want an energy part, we want a political part, we want a security part. I fully recognize there's challenges in many of those. I mean, if you start off with the political part, we currently have a rift, specifically with Qatar. So that has to be addressed. Economically, they are diverse economies, and there's a lot of pre-existing agreements, and we don't intend any of those to be superseded by Mesa. But specifically on the security point, and I can see Ken Pollock's here, we started off our part by actually having Ken come in and talk about his book, Armies of Sand. So we took a very realistic approach to what we were doing, I'd like to highlight. But we do think we've made progress. I would focus on 3 areas that we're really going to focus on when it comes to building these parts. The first one's capabilities. And they're very similar to the Secretary's 5 fingers here, but we're going to build a center where we teach best practices when it comes to maritime, air defense, border, cyber, asymmetric warfare, and then command and control. And they're going to be spread throughout the regions. We're going to look for places that we've already have infrastructure. This isn't about spending more money. This is about us being in a role of facilitator and instructor, and the countries themselves adding to the, and basically it's their expense. I'd also say that the next thing that we're going to focus on, and it is very consistent, I would say, with your paper, at least the security part. So I don't know if that means you need to change your ideas, but we're actually lined up pretty well.
It's actually good to hear, not
okay,
bad.
All right. So the common picture, I'd say the second one. So when it comes to joint strategy, identifying the threats, for example. So right now, the threats are Salafi jihadists, as you call them, terrorists, and the proxies of the Iranians. But it is important to point out that this is not an alliance to counter Iran. This is an alliance to defend ourselves, and that's the current threat. It could change in the future. Also, I'd say it requires a collective effort, and that's their third pillar. We need to have the ability to talk to each other, so interoperability, which still isn't completely fixed in NATO, for example. And we need to have common munitions, weapons, and we need to have the ability to actually work together. Specific to NATO, since this question's brought up, it is not the Arab NATO. There is no intent to turn this into like an Article 5 type situation where we have a treaty and required to defend. This is an attempt to work together with our GCC +2 Egypt and Jordan partners to make them more effective, so we can best defend ourselves and stabilize the region.
So I was going to follow up with you on one more question on this, which is just to say, I guess one of the things where we, at least where we focused on in terms of our report was to start small and build bigger. We really try to emphasize the fact that, if you paint it as a huge picture, if you paint it as Middle East NATO, you're going to get almost nowhere. But the other challenge is also, and I'm curious to your take on this, I think it'll probably be my last question because we'll have to move on, and we also know you're a busy guy who's got a lot of other things to do. But you know, the biggest challenge in some ways is not the capabilities sometimes, and it's not even, you know, agreeing on a threat picture. It's almost just the politics, like you said, and you referenced yourself, the politics of, for example, you know, division between Qatar and the other Gulf states, or even, you know, threat perceptions where, you know, some countries view, like Saudi Arabia would view Iran as the single most important challenge in the region. But others, like Egypt, are much more concerned with, for example, Salafist jihadist threat. And even defining, you know, there's different definitions of whether you are okay with the Muslim Brotherhood or you are not okay with the Muslim Brotherhood, and different countries have different views on that. So how do you navigate all of that when you're trying to do this?
Yeah, and I think those are all good points, and that's largely in the economic and political, and that's something that, you know, obviously from DoD, we support our State Department colleagues when they try to work through it, but I don't think there's going to be any answers, any easy answers, I should say. But I do think that we can eventually land on the need to defend ourselves and to have the ability to do that together, so that, as you mentioned, integrated missile defense is something we've been talking about a long time, and it benefits everybody. So from that perspective, I think there will be some commonalities that we can agree on. I do agree with the premise, and you brought it up because it was in one of your papers, that focusing small, and that's kind of my background as a paramilitary officer, but focusing on elite units that you can really make capable, competent, and of a caliber of unit that we would like to work with, which includes human rights and accountability. It's much easier to do when you do that at a small level. And the examples you used, I would agree with. The McGower Regiment in Lebanese Armed Forces. There was a great effort done in Afghanistan with NDS and the CTPTs. And those are examples, and I think that will probably be part of any efforts going forward when it comes to efforts like Syria or in Mesa.
Yeah, and I should also say that, you know, we heavily referenced Ken Pollack's book when making those recommendations.
You didn't ask me to do that either.
Well, he'll be talking about it later. Yeah. But Mick, thank you very much for taking this time with us. And I would like everybody to just say a thank you to Mick Mulroy, and then we'll move on to our next panel.
On Newsmakers, U.S. Representative Kathy Castor of Florida talks about climate issues, the Affordable Care Act, and Campaign 2020. She chairs the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Newsmakers, Sunday at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Sunday morning, the National Organization for Women's Tony Van Pelt will be with us to talk about current efforts to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Also, former Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka will talk about Campaign 2020 and President Trump's re-election strategy. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Sunday morning. Join the discussion. On American History TV, today at 2 p.m. Eastern on Oral Histories, our interview of World War II Navajo code talker Samuel Sow.
Big mouse, turkey, period, space, sheep. Sheep's eye is cured. That's all it said in plain English. But what it really meant is Mount Suribachi is secured.
Then at 8 p.m. on Lectures in History, Baylor University professor Julianne Sweet on the American military during the Revolutionary War.
So this right here is a handcrafted work of art created by a gunsmith who made lock, stock, and barrel every piece of this by hand. Each one's going to be individually different. This is why I'm saying don't lose it.
Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, astronaut Michael Collins on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing.
I think people in general, they want to go, to see, to touch, to smell, to understand, wherever that may be, on the surface of the planet, a a little bit above it, way above it, to the moon, beyond the moon to Mars, whatever. I think it's somehow within us to have this, it's not a need, but this will, this desire to explore.
And at 8 on the presidency, author Richard Carwardine on the sense of humor of Abraham Lincoln.
Riding through the woods, he met a lady on horseback. He waited for her to pass, but instead she stopped and scrutinized him before saying, "Well, for land's sake, you are the homeliest man I ever saw." "Oh, yes, madam, but I can't help it," he replied. "No, I suppose not," said the lady, "but you might stay at home."
This weekend on American History TV on C-SPAN 3.
On Monday, the National Urban League releases its 2019 annual report on voting rights. Watch live at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, online at cspan.org, or listen live on the free C-SPAN radio app. Also Monday, the U.S. Institute of Peace holds a discussion on China's role in the negotiations concerning North Korea's nuclear program. Watch live at 1:35 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, and that's also available online and through our radio app. Attorney General William Barr testifies on the report released by Special Counsel Robert Mueller on his investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. This was to be the first of 2 Hill appearances this week, but Mr. Barr pulled out of his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee on Thursday. He answered questions from the Senate Judiciary Committee on how his office handled the release of the Mueller report and other investigations that resulted from the special counsel's probe. This hour and 45-minute portion of the hearing includes opening statements from the committee's leaders and the Attorney General.
I know. Can you tell him?
Well, thank you. The hearing will come to order, and the first order of business is to try to cool the room down, so we'll see if we can do that. But the Attorney General will be testifying here in a bit about the Mueller report. And I want to thank him for coming to the committee and giving us an explanation as to the actions he took and why he took them regarding the Mueller report. And here's the good news. Here's the Mueller report. You can read it for yourself. It's about 400 and something pages. Can't say I've read it all, but I've read most of it. There's an unredacted version over in the classified section of the Senate, a room where you can go look at the unredacted version, and I did that, and I found it not to change anything in terms of an outcome. But a bit about the Mueller report. Who is Mueller? For those who may not know, I don't know where you've been, but you may not know, that Bob Mueller has a reputation in this town and throughout the country as being an outstanding lawyer and a man of the law. He was the FBI director. He was the Deputy Attorney General. He was in charge of the Criminal Division at the Department of Justice. He was a United States Marine, and he has served his country in a variety of circumstances long and well. For those who took time to read the report, I think it was well written, very thorough. And let me tell you what went into this report. There were 19 lawyers employed, approximately 40 FBI agents, intel analysts, forensic accountants, and other staff, 2,800 subpoenas issued, 500 witnesses interviewed, 500 search warrants executed, more than 230 orders for communication records so records could be obtained, 13 requests to foreign governments for evidence, over $25 million spent over 2 years. We may not agree on much, but I hope we can agree that he had ample resources, took a lot of time, and talked to a lot of people. And you can read for yourself what he found. The Attorney General will tell us a bit about what his opinion of the report is. In terms of interacting with the White House turned over to Mr. Mueller 1.4 million documents and records, never asserted executive privilege one time. Over 20 White House staffers, including 8 from the White House counsel's office, were interviewed voluntarily. Don McGahn, chief counsel for the White House, was interviewed for over 30 hours. Everybody that they wanted to talk to from the Trump campaign on the ground, they were able to talk to. The president submitted himself to written interrogatories. So to the American people, Mr. Mueller was the right guy to do this job. I always believed that Attorney General Sessions was conflicted out because he was part of the campaign. He was the right guy with ample resources, and the cooperation he needed to find out what happened was given, in my view. But there were 2 campaigns in 2016, and we'll talk about the second one in a minute. So what have we learned from this report? After all this time and all this money, Mr. Mueller and his team concluded there was no collusion. I didn't know. Like many of you here, on the Republican side, we all agreed that Mr. Mueller should be allowed to do his job without interference. I joined with some colleagues on the other side to introduce legislation to protect the special counsel, that he could only be removed for cause. He was never removed. He was allowed to do his job. So no collusion, no coordination, no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government regarding the 2016 election. As to obstruction of justice, Mr. Mueller left it to Mr. Barr to decide after 2 years and all this time. He said, Mr. Barr, you decide. Mr. Barr did. There are a bunch of lawyers on this committee, and I will tell you the following. You have to have specific intent to obstruct justice. If there's no underlying crime, pretty hard to figure out what intent might be if there was never a crime to begin with. The president never did anything to stop Mueller from doing his job. So I guess the theory goes now, okay, he didn't collude with the Russians and he didn't specifically do anything to stop Mueller, but attempted obstruction of justice of a crime that never occurred, I guess, is sort of the new standard around here. We'll see if that makes any sense. To me, it doesn't. Now, there's another campaign. It was the Clinton campaign. What have we learned from this report? The Russians interfered in our election. So can some bipartisanship come out of this? I hope so. I intend to work with my colleagues on the other side to introduce the Deter Act and to introduce legislation to defend the integrity of the voting system. Senator Durbin and I have legislation that would deny anyone admittance into the United States a visa through the immigration system if they were involved in interfering in an American election. I'm working with Senator Whitehouse and Blumenthal to make sure that if you hack into a state election system, even though it's not tied to the internet, that's a crime. I would like to do more to harden our infrastructure because the Russians did it. It wasn't some 400-pound guy sitting on a bed somewhere. It was the Russians. And they're still doing it. And it could be the Chinese, it could be somebody next. So my takeaway from this report is that we've got a lot of work to do to defend democracy against the Russians and other bad actors. And I promise the committee we will get on with that work, hopefully in a bipartisan fashion. The other campaign The other campaign was investigated not by Mr. Mueller, by people within the Department of Justice. The accusation against the Clinton, Secretary Clinton, was that she set a private server up somewhere in her house and classified information was on it to avoid the disclosure requirements and the transparency requirements required of being Secretary of State. So that was investigated. What do we know? We know that the person in charge of investigating hated Trump's guts. I don't know how Mr. Mueller felt about Trump, but I don't think anybody on our side believes that he had a personal animosity toward the president to the point he couldn't do his job. This is what Strzok said on February the 12th, 2016. Now, he's in charge of the Clinton email investigation. Oh, he's Trump's abysmal. I keep hoping the charade will end and people will just dump him. February the 12th, 2016. Page is the Department of Justice lawyer assigned to this case. March 3rd, 2016. God, Trump is a loathsome human being. Strzok. Oh my God, Trump's an idiot. Page, he's awful. Strzok. God, Hillary should win $100 million to nothing. Compare those two people to Mueller. March 16th, 2016. I cannot believe Trump is likely to be an actual serious candidate for president. July the 21st, 2016. Trump is a disaster. I have no idea how destabilizing his presidency would be. August the 8th, 2016. 3 days before Strzok was made deputy acting in charge of the counterintelligence division of the FBI. He's never going to become president, right? Page to Strzok. No, he won't. We'll stop him. These are the people investigating the Clinton email situation and start the counterintelligence investigation of the Trump campaign. Compare them to Mueller. August the 15th, 2016. Strzok. I want to believe the path you threw out for consideration in Andy's office, that there's no way he gets elected, but I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event you die before you're 40. August 26, 2016. Just went to the Southern Virginia Walmart. I could smell the Trump support. October the 19th, 2016. Trump is a fucking idiot. He's unable to provide a coherent answer. Sorry to the kids out there. These are the people that made a decision that Clinton didn't do anything wrong and a counterintelligence investigation of the Trump campaign was warranted. We're going to, in a bipartisan way, I hope, deal with Russia. But when the Mueller report is put to bed, and it soon will be, this committee is going to look long and hard at how this all started. We're going to look at the FISA warrant process. Did Russia provide Christopher Steele the information about Trump that turned out to be garbage that was used to get a warrant on an American citizen? And if so, how did the system fail? Was there a real effort between Papadopoulos and anybody in Russia to use the Clinton emails stole by the Russians, or was that thought planted in his mind? I don't know, but we're going to look. And I can tell you this, if you change the names, y'all would want to look too. Everything I just said, just substitute Clinton for Trump. And see what all these people with cameras would be saying out here about this. As to cooperation in the Clinton investigation, I told you what the Trump people did. I'll tell you a little bit about what the Clinton people did. There was a protective order for the server issued by the House, and there was a request by the State Department to preserve all the information on the server. Paul Gambetta, after having the protective order, used a software program called BleachBit to wipe this email server clean. Has anybody ever heard of Paul Gambetta? No. Under protective order from the House to preserve the information, under a request from the State Department to preserve the information on the server, he used a BleachBit program to wipe it clean. What happened to him? Nothing. 18 devices possessed by Secretary Clinton she used to do business as secretary. How many of them were turned over to the FBI? None. 2 of them couldn't be turned over because Judith Casper took a hammer and destroyed 2 of them. What happened to her? Nothing. So the bottom line is, we're about to hear from Mr. Barr the results of a 2-year investigation into the Trump campaign, all things Russia, the actions the president took before and after the campaign, $25 million, 40 FBI agents. I appreciate very much what Mr. Mueller did for the country. I have read most of the report. For me, it is over. Senator Feinstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Attorney General. On March 24th, you sent a letter to Chairman Graham and the ranking member of this committee, providing your summary of the principal conclusions set out in Special Counsel Mueller's report. This letter was widely reported as a win for the president and was characterized as confirming there was no conclusion. Following this letter, the White House put out a statement declaring the special counsel, and I quote, "The special counsel did not find any collusion and did not find any obstruction," end quote, and that the report, quote, "was a total and complete exoneration," end quote, of the president. However, last night, the Washington Post reported that Special Counsel Mueller sent you a letter in late March where he said your letter to Congress failed to, quote, "fully capture the context, nature, and substance of his office's work and conclusions," end quote, and that he spoke with you about the concern that the letter threatened to undermine the public confidence in the outcome of the investigations. That's in quotes as well. Then on April 18th, you held a press conference where you announced repeatedly that the Mueller report found no collusion and no evidence of a crime. An hour later, a redacted copy of the Mueller report was provided to the public and the Congress, and we saw why Mueller was concerned. Contrary to the declarations of the total and complete exoneration, the special counsel's report contained substantial evidence of misconduct. First, Special Counsel Mueller's report confirms that the Russian government implemented a social media campaign to mislead millions of Americans, and that Russian intelligence services hacked into the DNC and the DCCC computers, stole emails and memos, and systematically released them to impact the presidential election. Your March letter stated that there was no evidence that the Trump campaign, quote, "conspired or coordinated with Russia," end quote. However, the report outlined substantial evidence that the Trump campaign welcomed, encouraged, and expected to benefit electorally from Russia's interference in the election. The Mueller report also details how time and time again the Trump campaign took steps to gain advantage from Russia's unlawful interference. For example, President Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, passed internal campaign polling data, messaging, and strategy updates to Konstantin Kilimnik, a Russian national with ties to Russian intelligence. The Mueller report explains how Paul Manafort briefed Kilimnik in early August of 2016 on, and I quote, the state of the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win the election, end quote, including the campaign's focus on the battleground states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. Next, the Mueller report documents the Trump campaign's communications regarding Secretary Clinton's and the DNC's stolen emails. Specifically, the report states, and I quote, within approximately 5 hours of President Trump calling on Russia to find Secretary Clinton's emails, Russian intelligence agency GRU officers, quote, targeted for the first time Clinton's personal office, end quote. The Mueller report also reveals that President Trump repeatedly asked individuals affiliated with his campaign, including Michael Flynn, quote, to find the deleted Clinton emails, end quote. These efforts included suggestions to contact foreign intelligence services, Russian hackers, and individuals on the dark web. The report confirms that Trump knew of WikiLeaks releases of the stolen emails and received status updates about upcoming releases, while his campaign promoted coverage of the leaks. Donald Trump Jr. communicated directly with WikiLeaks and at its request publicly tweeted a link to emails stolen from Clinton's campaign manager. Second, in your March letter to Congress, you concluded, and I quote, that the evidence is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense, end quote. However, Special Counsel Mueller methodically outlines 10 episodes, some continuing multiple actions by the president to mislead the American people and interfere with the investigations into Russian interference and obstruction. In one example, the president repeatedly called White House counsel Don McGahn at home and directed him to fire Mueller, saying, quote, Mueller has to go. Call me back when you do it. Then later, the president repeatedly ordered McGahn to release a press statement and write a letter saying the president did not order Mueller fired. The Mueller report also outlines efforts by President Trump to influence witness testimony and deter cooperation with law enforcement. For example, the president's team communicated to witnesses that pardons would be available if they, quote, stayed on message, end quote, and remained, quote, on the team, end quote. In one case, the president sent messages through his personal lawyers to Paul Manafort that he would be taken care of and just, quote, sit tight, end quote. The president then publicly affirmed this communication by stating that Manafort was, quote, a brave man, end quote, for refusing to break. Similarly, the Mueller report stated the president used inducements in the form of positive messages in an effort to get Michael Cohen not to cooperate, and then turned to attacks and intimidation to deter the provision of information or undermine Cohen's credibility. Finally, while the March letter to Congress and the April press conference left the impression there were no remaining questions to examine, this report notes several limitations Mueller faced while gathering the facts that Congress needed to examine. More than once, the report documents that legal conclusions were not drawn because witnesses refused to answer questions or failed to recall the events. In addition, numerous witnesses, including but not limited to Jared Kushner, Sarah Sanders, Rudolph Giuliani, Michael Flynn, Steve Bannon, and John Kelly, all stated they could not recall events. The president himself said more than 30 times that he could not recall or remember enough to be able to answer written questions from the special counsel. The special counsel also recounted that, quote, some associated with the Trump campaign deleted relevant communications or communicated during the relevant period using applications that featured encryption or do not provide for long-term retention of data, end quote. Based on these gaps, the Mueller report concluded, and I quote again, the office cannot rule out the possibility that the unavailable information would have shed additional light on or cast a new light on events described in the report, end quote. And contrary to the conclusion that the special counsel's report did not find evidence of communication or coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia, the Mueller report explicitly states, and I quote, a statement that the investigation did not establish particular facts does not mean there was no evidence of those facts. Volume 2, page 2. Let me conclude with this. Congress has both the constitutional duty and the authority to investigate the serious findings contained in the Mueller report. I strongly believe that this committee needs to hear directly from Special Counsel Mueller about his views on the report in his March letter. I also believe senators should have the opportunity to ask him about these subjects in questions directly. I have requested this to our chairman to authorize a hearing with Special Counsel Mueller, and I hope that will happen soon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before we receive your testimony, Mr. Barr, we have the letter that Mr. Mueller sent to you on March 27th, 2019. I'll put that in the record now. The floor is yours. What? Got to swear you in? Sorry. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Feinstein, members of the committee. During my confirmation process, there were two concerns that dominated, as I think you will all agree. The first was whether I would in any way impede or curtail Special Counsel Mueller's investigation, and the second, whether I would make public his final report. As you see, Bob Mueller was allowed to complete his work as he saw fit. And as to the report, even though the applicable regulations require that the report is to be made to the AG and is to remain confidential and not be made public, I told this committee that I intended to exercise whatever discretion I had to make as much of the report available to the public and to congressional leaders as I could, consistent with the law. This has been done. I arrived at the department on February 14th. And shortly thereafter, I asked it to be communicated to Bob Mueller's team that in preparing the report, we requested that they make it so we could readily identify 6E material so we could quickly process the report.
Could you tell the public what 6E is?
6E is grand jury material that cannot be made public. It's prohibited by statute. And I wanted that identified so we could redact that material and prepare the report for public release as quickly as we could. When I arrived at the department, I found, and was eventually briefed in on the investigation, I found that the Deputy Attorney General and his principal associate deputy, Ed O'Callahan, were in regular discussions with the counsel's office, had been, and they communicated this request and had discussions about both the timing of the report and the nature of the report. On March 5th, I met with Bob at the suggestion of the deputy and the principal associate deputy, Bob Mueller. I met with Bob Mueller to get a readout on what his conclusions would be. On March 25th, and at that meeting, I reiterated to Special Counsel Mueller that in order to have the shortest possible time before I was in a position to release the report, I asked that they identify 6E material. When I received the report on March 22nd, and we were hoping to have that easily identified, the 6E material, unfortunately, it did not come in that form. And it quickly became apparent that it would take about 3 or 4 weeks to identify that material and other material that have to be redacted. So there was necessarily going to be a gap between the receipt of the report and getting the full report out publicly. The deputy and I identified 4 categories of information that we believe required redaction. And I think you all know of them, but they were the grand jury material, the 6E material, information that the intelligence community advised would reveal sensitive sources and methods, information that if revealed at this stage would impinge on the investigation or prosecution of related cases, and information that would unfairly affect the privacy and reputational interests of peripheral third parties. We went about redacting this material in concert with the special counsel's office. We needed their assistance to identify the 6E material in particular. The redactions were all carried out by DOJ lawyers with special counsel lawyers in consultation with intelligence community. The report contained a substantial amount of material over which the president could have asserted executive privilege, but the president made the decision not to assert executive privilege and to make public as much of the report as we could, subject to the redactions that we thought required. Now, as you see, the report has been lightly redacted. The public version has been estimated to have only 10% redactions. Almost the vast bulk of those redactions are in Volume 1, which is the volume that deals with collusion, and it relates to existing ongoing cases. Volume 2 has only about 2% redactions for the public version, so 98% of Volume 2, dealing with obstruction, is available to the public. We have made a version of the report available to congressional leaders that only contains redactions of grand jury material. For this version, overall redactions are less than 2% for the whole report, and for Volume 2, dealing with obstruction, they are less than 0.1%. So given the limited nature of redactions, I believe that the publicly released report will allow every American to understand the results of the special counsel's work. By now, everyone is familiar with the special counsel's bottom line conclusions about Russian attempts to interfere in the election. In Volume 1, the special counsel found that the Russians engaged in 2 distinct schemes. First, the Internet Research Agency, a Russian entity with close ties to the Russian government, conducted a disinformation and social media operation to sow discord among Americans. Second, the GRU, Russian military intelligence, hacked into computers and stole emails from individuals affiliated with the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton's campaign. The special counsel investigated whether anyone affiliated with President Trump's campaign conspired or coordinated with these criminal schemes. They concluded that there was not sufficient evidence to establish that there had been any conspiracy or coordination with the Russian government or the IRA. As you know, Volume 2 of his report dealt with obstruction, and the special counsel considered whether certain actions of the president could amount to obstruction. He decided not to reach a conclusion. Instead, the report recounts 10 episodes and discusses potential legal theories for connecting the president's actions to elements of obstruction offenses. Now, we first heard that the special counsel's decision not to decide the obstruction issue at the March 5th meeting when he came over to the department, and we were frankly surprised that they were not going to reach a decision on obstruction. And we asked them a lot about the reasoning behind this and the basis for this. Special Counsel Mueller stated 3 times to us in that meeting in response to our questioning that he emphatically was not saying that but for the OLC opinion, he would have found obstruction. He said that in the future, the facts of a case against the president might be such that a special counsel would recommend abandoning the OLC opinion, but this is not such a case. We did not understand exactly why the special counsel was not reaching a decision. And when we pressed him on it, he said that his team was still formulating the explanation. Once we heard that the special counsel was not reaching a conclusion on obstruction, the deputy and I discussed and agreed that the department had to reach a decision. We had the responsibility to assess the evidence as set forth in the report and to make the judgment. I say this because the special counsel was appointed to carry out the investigative and prosecutorial functions of the department and to do it as part of the Department of Justice. The powers he was using, including the power of using a grand jury and using compulsory process, exist for that purpose, the function of the Department of Justice in this arena, which is to determine whether or not there has been criminal conduct. It's a binary decision. Is there enough evidence to show a crime? And do we believe a crime has been committed? We don't conduct criminal investigations just to collect information and put it out to the public. We do so to make a decision. And here we thought there was an additional reason, which is this was a very public investigation. And we had made clear that the results of the investigation were going to be made public. And the deputy and I felt that the evidence developed by the special counsel was not sufficient to establish that the president committed a crime, and therefore it would be irresponsible and unfair for the department to release a report without stating the department's conclusions, and thus leave it hanging as to whether the department considered there had been criminal conduct. So the Deputy Attorney General and I conducted a careful review of the report with our staffs and legal advisors. And while we disagreed with some of the legal theories and felt that many of the episodes discussed in the report would not constitute obstruction as a matter of law, we didn't rest our decision on that. We took each of the 10 episodes and we assessed them against the analytical framework that had been set forth by the special counsel, and we concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation was not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Let me just talk a little bit about this March 24th letter and Bob Mueller's letter, I think, on the which I received on the 28th. When the report came in on the 22nd and we saw it was going to take a great deal of time to get it out to the public, I made the determination that we had to put out some information about the bottom line. The body politic was in a high state of agitation. There was massive interest in learning what the bottom line results of Bob Mueller's investigation was, particularly as to collusion. Former government officials were confidently predicting that the president and members of his family were going to be indicted. There were people suggesting that if it took any time to turn around the report and get it out, it would mean that the president was in legal jeopardy. So I didn't feel that it was in the public interest to allow this to go on for several weeks without saying anything. And so I decided to simply state what the bottom line conclusions were, which is what the department normally does, make a binary determination. Is there a crime or isn't there a crime? We prepared the letter for that purpose, to state the bottom line conclusions. We used the language from the report to state those bottom line conclusions. I analogize it to announcing after an extended trial what the verdict of the trial is, pending release of the full transcript. That's what we were trying to do, notify the people as to the bottom line conclusion. We were not trying to summarize the 410-page report. So we released that. I offered Bob Mueller the opportunity to review that letter before it went out, and he declined. On Thursday morning, I received, it probably was received at the department Wednesday night or evening, but on Thursday morning I received a letter from Bob, the letter that's just been put into the record. And I called Bob and said, you know, what's the issue here? And I asked him if he was suggesting that the March 24th letter was inaccurate, and he said no, but that the press reporting had been inaccurate, and that the press was reading too much into it. And I asked him, you know, specifically what his concern was, and he said that his concern focused on his explanation of why he did not reach a conclusion on obstruction, and he wanted more put out on that issue. He argued for putting out summaries of each volume, the executive summaries that had been written by his office, and if not that, then other material that focused on the issue of why he didn't reach the obstruction question. But he was very clear with me that he was not suggesting that we had misrepresented his report. I told Bob that I was not interested in putting out summaries, and I wasn't going to put out the report piecemeal. I wanted to get the whole report out, and I thought summaries by very definition, regardless of who prepared them, would be under-inclusive, and we'd have sort of a series of different debates and public discord over each tranche of information that went out, and I wanted to get everything out at once, and we should start working on that. And so the following day, I put out a letter explaining the process we were following and stressing that the March 24th letter was not a summary of the report, but a statement of the principal conclusions, and that people would be able to see Bob Mueller's entire thinking when the report was made public. So I'll end my statement there, Mr. Chairman, and glad to take any questions.
Thank you very much. As to the actual report itself, was there ever an occasion where you wanted to, something was redacted from the report that Mr. Mueller objected to?
I wouldn't say objected to. My understanding is the categories were defined by me and the deputy. I don't think that, I have no, I don't believe.
Did you work with him to redact the report?
Right. Those categories were executed by DOJ lawyers working with his lawyers. I think there were maybe a few judgment calls, very few, as to whether or not something as a prudential matter should be treated as a reputational interest or something. So there may have been some occasions of that, but as far as I'm aware.
I understand it, you did not want to hurt somebody's reputation unless it really affected the outcome, is that correct?
Right.
So was there any disagreement about 6E material?
Not that I'm aware of.
Any disagreement about classified information?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So the conclusions in your 4-page summary, you think, accurately reflect his bottom line on collusion. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you can read it for yourself if you got any doubt. As to obstruction of justice, were you surprised he was going to let you decide?
Yes, I was surprised. I think the function he was carrying out, the investigative and prosecutive function, is performed for the purpose of making that.
How many people did he actually indict? Do you know?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
So he actually has the ability to indict if he wants to. He's used that power during the investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the other thing that was confusing to me is that the investigation carried on for a while as additional episodes were looked into, episodes involving the president. And so my question is, or was, why were those investigated if at the end of the day you weren't going to reach a decision on them?
So did you consult Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein about the obstruction matter?
Constantly, yeah.
So was he in agreement with your decision not to proceed forward?
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry, the agreement what?
Not to proceed forward with obstruction.
Right.
Okay. So very quickly, give us your reasoning why you think it would be inappropriate to proceed forward on obstruction of justice in this case.
Well, generally speaking, an obstruction case typically has two aspects to it. One, there's usually an underlying criminality that's
Let's stop right there.
Yeah.
Was there an underlying crime here?
No.
So usually there is.
Usually. But it's not necessary, but the typical case, sort of the paradigmatic case is there's an underlying crime, and then the person implicated or people implicated are concerned about that criminality being discovered, take an inherently malignant act, as the Supreme Court has said, to obstruct that investigation,
so
such as
the
destroying documents.
That people were worried about, that he fired Comey to stop the Russian investigation. That's one of the concerns people had. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Comey. I do not have confidence in him, Comey, any longer. That was Chuck Schumer, November the 2nd, 2016. I think he, Comey, should take a hard look at what he has done, and I think it would not be a bad thing for the American people if he did step down. Bernie Sanders, January the 15th, 2017. The president ought to fire Comey immediately, and he ought to initiate an investigation. That is Congressman Nadler, November the 14th, 2016. Did you have a problem with the way Comey handled the Clinton email investigation?
Yes, I said so at the time.
Okay. So, given the fact that a lot of people, Comey should be fired, did you find that to be a persuasive act of obstructing justice?
No. I think even the report at the end of the day came to the conclusion, if you read the analysis, that a reason that loomed large there for his termination was his refusal to tell the public what he was privately telling the president, which was that the president was not under investigation.
As to where we go forward, as to how we go forward, would you recommend that this committee and every other committee of Congress do our best to harden our infrastructure against future Russian attacks?
Absolutely, yes.
Do you think Russia is still up to it?
Yes.
Do you think other countries may get involved in our elections in 2020?
Yes.
So you would support an effort by Congress working with the administration to harden our electoral infrastructure?
Yes.
Is that one of the takeaways of the Mueller report?
Yes.
Do you share my concerns about the FISA warrant process?
Yes.
Do you share my concerns about the counterintelligence investigation, how it was opened and why it was opened?
Yes.
Do you share my concerns that the lack of professionalism in the Clinton email investigation is something we should all look at?
Yes.
Okay. Do you expect to change your mind about the bottom line conclusions of the Mueller report?
No.
Do you know Bob Mueller?
Yes.
Do you trust him?
Yes.
How long have you known him?
30 years, roughly.
You think he had the time he needed?
Yes.
You think he had the money he needed?
Yes.
Do you think he had the resources he needed?
Yes.
Do you think he did a thorough job?
Yes, and I think he feels he did a thorough job and had adequate evidence to make the calls.
Do you think the president's campaign in 2016 was thoroughly looked at in terms of whether or not they colluded with the Russians?
Yes.
And the answer is no, according to Bob Mueller.
That's right.
He couldn't decide about obstruction. You did. Is that correct?
That's right.
You feel good about your decision?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Chairman, Mr. Attorney General, the special counsel's report describes how the president directed White House counsel Don McGahn to fire special counsel Mueller and later told McGahn to write a letter, quote, for our records, end quote, stating that the president had not ordered him to fire Mueller. The report also recounts how the president made repeated efforts to get McGahn to change his story. Knowing that McGahn believed the president's version of events was false, the special counsel found, and I quote, substantial evidence, end quote, that the president tried to change McGahn's account in order to prevent further scrutiny of the president towards the investigation. Special counsel also found that McGahn is a credible witness with no motive to lie or exaggerate given the position he held in the White House. Here's the question. Does existing law prohibit efforts to get a witness to lie, to say something the witness believes is false?
Yes.
And
lie to the government, yes.
And what law is that?
Obstruction statutes.
The obstruction statute. And you don't have it, I guess, before you.
Well, I'm not sure which one they were referring to here. It was probably 1512C2.
So these things, in effect, constitute obstruction.
Well, you're talking in general terms. You're not talking.
What I'm talking about specifically, yes, you're correct in a sense that the special counsel in his report found substantial evidence that the president tried to change McGahn's account in order to prevent, and this is a quote, further scrutiny of the president toward the investigation, end quote. The special counsel also found McGahn is a credible witness with no motive to lie or exaggerate. So what I'm asking you then, is that a credible charge under the obstruction statute?
We felt that that episode, the government would not be able to establish obstruction. If you go back and if you look at the episode where the president gave McGahn an instruction, McGahn's version of that is quite clear, and each time he gave it, which is that the instruction said, go to Rosenstein, raise the issue of conflict of interest, and Mueller has to go because of this conflict of interest. So there's no question that whatever instruction was giving McGahn had to do with Mueller's conflict of interest. Now, the president later said that what he meant was that the conflict of interest should be raised with Rosenstein, but the decision should be left with Rosenstein. On the other end of the spectrum, it appears that McGahn felt it was more directive and that the president was essentially saying, push Rosenstein to invoke a conflict of interest to push Mueller out. Wherever it fell on that spectrum of interest, the New York Times story was very different. The New York Times story said flat out that the president directed the firing of Mueller. He told McGahn, fire Mueller. Now, there's something very different between firing a special counsel outright, which suggests ending the investigation, and having a special counsel removed for conflict, which suggests that you're going to have another special counsel. So the fact is that even under McGahn's and then, as the report says and recognizes, there is evidence the president truly felt that the Times article was inaccurate and he wanted McGahn to correct it. So we believe that it would be impossible for the government to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that the president understood that he was instructing McGahn to say something false, because it wasn't necessarily false. Moreover, McGahn had weeks before already given testimony to the special counsel, and the president was aware of that. And as the report indicates, it could also have been the case that that he was primarily concerned about press reports and making it clear that he never outright directed the firing of Mueller. So in terms of the request to ask McGahn to memorialize that fact, we do not think in this case that the government could show corrupt intent beyond a reasonable doubt.
Just to finish this, but you still have a situation where a president essentially tries to change the lawyer's account in order to prevent further criticism of himself.
Well, that's not a crime.
So you can, in this situation, instruct someone to lie?
No, it has to be, well, to be obstruction of justice, the lie has to be tied to impairing the evidence in a particular proceeding. McGahn had already given his evidence, and I think it would be plausible that the purpose of McGahn memorializing what the president was asking was to make the record that the president never directed him to fire. And there is a distinction between saying to someone, go fire him, go fire Mueller, and saying, have him removed based on conflict.
And what would
they have different results.
What would that conflict be?
Well, the difference between them is if you remove someone for a conflict of interest, then there would be presumably another person appointed.
Yeah, but wouldn't you have to have it in this kind of situation, an identifiable conflict that made sense, or else doesn't it just become a fabrication?
Well, now we're going to shift from the issue of writing the memo or somehow putting out a release later on, and the issue of the actual direction to McGahn. So the question on the direction to McGahn has a number of different levels to it. And first, as a matter of law, I think the department's position would be that the president can direct the termination or the replacement of a special counsel. And as a matter of law, the obstruction statute does not reach that conduct. Putting that aside, the next question would be, even if it reached the conduct, could you here establish corrupt intent beyond a reasonable doubt? What makes this case very interesting is that when you take away the fact that there were no underlying criminal conduct, and you take away the fact that there was no inherently malign obstructive act, that is, the president was carrying out his constitutional duties. The question is, what is the impact of taking away the underlying crime? It's not, as the report suggests, that one impact is, well, we have to find some other reason why the president would obstruct the investigation. But there's another impact, which is, if the president is being falsely accused, which the evidence now suggests that the accusations against him were false, and he knew they were false, and he felt that this investigation was unfair, propelled by his political opponents, and was hampering his ability to govern, that is not a corrupt motive for replacing an independent counsel. So that's another reason that we would say that the government would have difficulty proving this beyond a reasonable doubt.
My time is up. Thank
Senator Grass.
Senator Johnson and I wrote you about text messages between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page that appear to show the FBI may have tried to use counterintelligence briefings for the Trump transition team as intelligence gathering operations. I hope you will commit to answering the letter in writing, but also providing committees the requested briefing. That's my question.
Yes, Senator.
Have you already task any staff to look into whether spying by the FBI and other agencies on the Trump campaign was properly predicated? And can Congress expect a formal report on your findings?
Yes, I do have people in the department helping me review the activities over the summer of 2016.
I suppose it depends on what conclusions you come to, but is there any reason why Congress wouldn't be briefed on your conclusions?
You know, it's a little early for me to commit completely, but I envision some kind of reporting at the end of this.
The Clinton campaign and the Democrat National Committee hired Fusion GPS to do opposition research against candidate Trump. Fusion GPS then hired Christopher Steele, former British intelligence officer, to compile what we all know as the Steele dossier that reportedly used Russian government sources for information. The Steele dossier was central to the now debunked collusion narrative. Now, here's the irony. The Mueller report spent millions investigating and found no collusion between Trump campaign and Russia. But the Democrats paid for a document created by a foreign national with reported foreign government sources. Not Trump, but the Democrats. That's the definition of collusion. Despite the central status of the Steele dossier to the collusion narrative, the Mueller report failed to analyze whether the dossier was filled with disinformation to mislead U.S. intelligence agencies and the FBI. My question, Mueller spent over 2 years, $30 million investigating Russian interference in the election. In order for a full accounting of Russian interference attempts, shouldn't the special counsel have considered on whether the Steele dossier was part of a Russian disinformation and interference campaign?
I don't, you know, Special Counsel Mueller has put out his report, and I have not yet had anyone go through the full scope of his investigation to determine whether he did address or look at all into those issues. One of the things I'm doing in my review is to try to assemble all the existing information out there about it, not only from Hill Investigations and the OIG, but also to see what the special counsel looked into. So I really couldn't say what he actually looked into.
But you think, in other words, if you had looked at all that information right now, you're telling me you could have said yes or no to my question?
If I had looked at it.
Yeah. And you're going to
Yes.
attempt to find some of this information
Yes.
if it's available?
Yes.
Similarly, shouldn't the special counsel have looked into the origins of the FBI's investigation into alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia?
The origins of that narrative?
Yes.
I don't know if he viewed his charter that broadly, and I don't know whether he did or not. That's something that I am reviewing, and again, we'll look at whatever the special counsel has developed on that.
Yeah. In Volume 2 of the report, the special counsel declined to make a traditional prosecutorial decision. Instead, the special counsel laid out 200 or so pages relating to a potential obstruction analysis and then dumped that on your desk. In your press conference, you said that you asked the special counsel whether he would have made a charging decision or recommended charges on obstruction, but for the Office of Legal Counsel's opinion on charging sitting presidents, and that the special counsel made clear that was not the case. So, Mr. Barr, is that an accurate description of your conversation with the special counsel?
Yes, he reiterated several times in a group meeting that he was not saying that but for the OLC opinion he would have found obstruction.
Yeah. If the special counsel found facts sufficient to constitute obstruction of justice, would he have stated that finding?
If he had found that, then I think he would state it, yes.
Okay. Was it Special Counsel Mueller's responsibility to make a charging recommendation?
I think the Deputy Attorney General and I thought it was, but not just charging, but to determine whether or not conduct was criminal. The President would be charged, could not be charged as long as he was in office.
Do you agree with the reasons that he offered for not making a decision in Volume 2 of his report, and why or why not?
I'm not really sure of his reasoning. I really could not recapitulate his analysis, which is one of the reasons in my March 24th letter, I simply stated the fact that he did not reach a conclusion and didn't try to put words in his mouth. I think that if he felt that he shouldn't go down the path of making a traditional prosecutive decision, then he shouldn't have investigated. That was the time to pull up.
Okay. There have been a number of leaks coming out of the Justice Department and FBI during high-profile investigations. The Inspector General found that during the department's investigation of Hillary Clinton for mishandling highly classified information, there was a culture of unauthorized media contacts. During the Russian investigation, the leaks continued. Leaks undermined the ability of investigators to investigate. Further leaks to the papers while Congress's questions to the department go unanswered is unacceptable. Why? What are you doing to investigate unauthorized media contacts by the department and FBI officials during the Russian investigation?
We have multiple criminal leak investigations underway.
Thank you.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Attorney General. I'm somewhat troubled by your testimony here and in the other body. You appeared before the House Appropriations on April 9th. You were asked about media reports that portrayed the special counsel's team as frustrated that your March 24th letter didn't adequately portray the report's findings. When the congressman, I believe it was Congressman Christ, asked if you knew what those members of the special counsel's team were concerned about, you testified in response, "No, I don't." You then said you merely suspected they would have preferred more information was released with the letter. Now we know, contrary to what you said on April 9th, that on March 27th, Robert Mueller wrote to you expressing very specific concerns that your March 24th letter, remember you're testifying on April 9th, that your March 24th letter failed to capture the, to quote Mr. Mueller, the context, nature, and substance, close quote, of his report. And what really struck me, Mr. Mueller wrote that your letter threatened to undermine a central purpose for which the department appointed the special counsel, to assure full public confidence in the outcome of the investigation. Why did you testify on April 9th that you didn't know the concerns being expressed by Mueller's team, when in fact you had heard those concerns directly from Mr. Mueller 2 weeks before?
Well, as I said, I talked directly to Bob Mueller about his letter to me and specifically asked him, what exactly are your concerns? Are you saying that the March 24th letter was misleading or inaccurate, or what? He indicated that it was not. He was not saying that, and that what he was concerned about—
That wasn't my question.
Well, I'm getting to the question, which is the question from Christ was, reports have emerged recently, press reports, that members of the special counsel's team are frustrated at some level with the limited information included in your March 24th letter, in that they don't adequately or accurately portray the report's findings. I don't know what members he's talking about. I certainly am not aware of any challenge to the accuracy of the findings.
Mr. Barr, you seem to have learned the filibuster rules even better than senators do. My question was, why did you say you were not aware of concerns when weeks before your testimony, Mr. Mueller had expressed concerns to you? I mean, that's a fairly simple.
Well, I answered a question, and the question was relating to unidentified members who were expressing frustration over the accuracy relating to findings. I don't know what that refers to at all. I talked directly to Bob Mueller, not members of his team, and even though I did not know what was being referred to, and Mueller had never told me that the expression of the findings was inaccurate, but I did then volunteer that I thought they were talking about the desire to have more information put out. But it wasn't my purpose to put out more information.
Well, Mr. Barr, I feel your answer was purposely misleading, and I think others do too. Let me ask you another one. You said the president is fully cooperating with an investigation, but his attorney had told a defendant he'd be taken care of if he didn't cooperate with the investigation. Is there a conflict in that?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat
Both
that?
Mr. Manafort and Mr. Cohen were told by Trump's personal attorney they'd be taken care of if they did not cooperate. You said that the president was fully cooperating. Is there a conflict there? Yes or no?
No.
Okay. Do you think it's fully cooperating to instruct a former aide to tell the Attorney General to unrecuse himself, shut down the investigation, and declare the president did nothing wrong?
I don't think, well, obviously, since I didn't find it was obstruction, I felt that the evidence could not support an obstruction.
I'm asking if that's fully cooperating. I'm not asking whether that's obstruction. Is that fully cooperating?
Yeah, he fully cooperated.
So by instructing a former aide to tell the Attorney General to unrecuse himself, shut down the investigation, and declare the president did nothing wrong, that's fully cooperating.
Where is that in the report?
That is on Volume 2, page 5. On June 19, 2017, the president dictated a message for Lewandowski to deliver to Sessions. The message said the Sessions should publicly announce that notwithstanding his recusal from the Russian investigation, the investigation is very unfair to the president. The president did nothing wrong.
Right. Okay, so
cooperating?
Well, firstly, asking Sessions to unrecuse himself, we do not think is obstruction.
And to declare the president did nothing wrong. I'm not asking you if it's obstruction. Is it cooperating?
Well, I don't know if that declares the president did nothing wrong, although the president, in terms of collusion, did nothing wrong. Isn't that correct?
Well, collusion is not a crime. It's the obstructing. But is that fully cooperating to say that?
Well, I don't see any conflict between that and fully cooperating with the investigation.
The president, of course, declared many times publicly in tweets and at campaign rallies and all that he would testify fully. He never did testify, correct?
As far as I know.
Well, I think you know whether he testified or not.
As far as I know, he didn't testify.
And Mr. Mueller found the written answers to be inadequate. Is that correct?
I think he wanted additional, but he never sought it.
And the president never testified.
Well, he never pushed it.
The president never testified. Does the fact that Mr. Mueller found the Trump campaign was receptive to some of the offers of assistance from Russia, or the fact that the Trump campaign never reported any of this to the FBI, does that trouble you?
What would they report to the FBI?
That they were receptive to offers of assistance from Russia.
What do you mean by receptive? I think the report says, obviously, obviously they were expecting to benefit from whatever the Russians.
Page 173, the Volume 1 report says, in sum, the investigation established multiple links between Trump campaign officials and individuals tied to the Russian government. Those links included Russian offers of assistance to the campaign, and in some instances, the campaign was receptive to the offer, whereas others, they were not.
Well,
That doesn't bother you at all?
well, I have to understand exactly what that refers to, what communications that referred to.
Well, you have the report, and I just gave you the page for the report. And I know my time is up, and I'm making the chairman nervous.
No, just very well done. Senator Cornyn.
General Barr, the chairman has pointed out that after the Hillary Clinton email investigation, there were a number at Mr. Comey's press conference, I think it was July the 5th, roughly 2016, there were a number of prominent Democratic members of the Senate who said that Comey should resign or be fired. I believe you said that you've concluded as a matter of law that the president, as the head of the executive branch of government, has the right to fire executive branch employees. Is that correct?
That's right.
In this case, the president was relying, at least in part, on a recommendation by the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, arising out of Rod Rosenstein's critique of Mr. Comey's conduct in holding that press conference, releasing derogatory information about Secretary Clinton, but then announcing that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges against her. Is that right?
That's right.
You started your career, I believe, in the intelligence community, and then moved on, of course, to the Department of Justice. And thank you for agreeing to serve again as Attorney General and help restore the department's reputation as an impartial arbiter of the law and not as a political arm of any administration. I think that's very, very important that you and Director Wray continue your efforts in that regard, and I'm grateful to you for that. But I do believe that we need to ask the question, why didn't the Obama administration do more as early as 2014 in investigating Russian efforts to prepare to undermine and sow dissension in the 2016 election? Mr. Mueller's report does document that the Russian government, through the intelligence, through their intelligence agencies and their internet research, or IRA, I think it's called, began as early as 2014, began their efforts to do so, and we know they met with some success. Is it any surprise to you, based on your experience, that the Russians would try to do everything they can to sow dissension in American political life, including in our elections?
No, not at all. I mean, I think the internet creates a lot more opportunities to have a, to have that kind of covert effect on American body politics. So it's getting more and more dangerous. But the Russians have been at this for a long time in various different ways. But the point you made about Bob Mueller's efforts on IRA, that's one of the things that struck me about the report. I think it's very impressive work that they did in moving quickly to get into the IRA and also the GRU folks. And I was thinking to myself, if that had been done in 2000, starting in the beginning of 2016, we would have been a lot further along.
For example, we've heard a lot about the Steele dossier. Mr. Steele, of course, is a former British intelligence officer hired to do opposition research by the Hillary Clinton campaign on her political adversaries, including President Trump or candidate Trump at that time. How do we know that the Steele dossier is not itself evidence of Russian disinformation campaign, knowing what we know now, that basically the allegations made therein were secondhand, hearsay, or unverified? Can we state with confidence that the Steele dossier was not part of the Russian disinformation campaign?
No, I can't state that with confidence, and that is one of the areas that I'm reviewing. I'm concerned about it, and I don't think it's entirely speculative.
Well, we know that from published reports that the head of the CIA, Mr. Brennan, went to President Obama and brought his concerns about initial indications of Russian involvement in the campaign as early as the late July 2016. And instead of doing more during the Obama administration to look into that and disrupt and deter Russian activities that threatened the validity and integrity of our campaign in 2016, it appears to me that the Obama administration, Justice Department, and FBI decided to place their bets on Hillary Clinton and focus their efforts on investigating the Trump campaign. But as you have pointed out, thanks to the special counsel, we now have confidence that no Americans colluded with the Russians in their effort to undermine the American people. We now need to know, and I'm glad to hear what you are telling us about your inquiries and your research and your investigation. We now need to know what steps the Obama, FBI, Department of Justice, and intelligence community, what steps they took to undermine the political process and put a thumb on the scale in favor of one political candidate over the other, and that would be before and after the 2016 election. What's a defensive briefing that in a counterintelligence investigation?
Well, you could have different kinds of defensive briefings. If you learn that somebody is being targeted by a hostile intelligence service, then one form of defensive briefing is to go and to alert that person to